Welcome back, Legends. You're at Vision Harry. Another incredible story awaits. Harry collapsed on Hogwarts Express and healers found 35 tracking charms back to Dumbledore's office. Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The boy who fell. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock sharp, the same as it always had, the same as it probably always would. Steam rolled back along the length of the Scarlet engine in great white billows, and the platform dissolved behind the last carriage the way platforms always do, gradually, then all at once, until there was nothing left but countryside and the smell of somebody's packed lunch drifting down the corridor. Harry had a window seat. He'd taken it automatically, the way he did most things these days, automatically, without much thought, without much of anything really. He watched the fields go by and pressed his forehead against the cool glass and told himself he was fine. He'd been telling himself that for about 2 months. The summer had been, well. The summer had been the summer. The Dursleys. The small bedroom. The lock that Vernon had reinstalled on the door despite the letter the ministry had sent warning him against it, because Vernon Dursley had never once in his life let a strongly worded letter change a decision he'd already made. The heat had been punishing this year, and Harry had spent most of it lying on his bed staring at the ceiling, sweating through his 2 large cast-off shirts, and feeling a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't quite locate the source of. He'd assumed it was grief. Sirius had died in June, falling through a curtain in the Department of Mysteries, and the last 2 months had mostly been Harry trying very hard not to think about that and thinking about it constantly. So the heaviness made sense. The exhaustion made sense. The way his magic felt sluggish and distant, like trying to reach something through deep water, that he'd chalked up to stress, to emotional suppression, to the general misery of being 16 and alone in a house where nobody particularly wanted him. That was the story he'd been running, and it had served him well enough to get him to September 1st. He just hadn't expected the story to stop working quite so suddenly. "You look terrible," Ron said, dropping into the seat across from him with a chocolate frog already half unwrapped. He said it the way Ron said most things, plainly, without cruelty, like he was observing a weather condition. Like, genuinely. "Did you sleep at all this summer?" "Some." "How much is some?" Harry considered. "Enough." Ron looked at him for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully, then looked at Hermione, who had taken the seat beside Harry and was already extracting a book from her bag with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since accepted that this train journey was valuable reading time. "He looks terrible," Ron told her. "I can see that," Hermione said, but she glanced at Harry with something sharper than casual concern, the kind of look she got when she was already filing information away and building a theory she hadn't yet voiced. "I'm fine," Harry said. "You said that in your letters, too," Hermione said. "All 3 of them." "Because I was fine." "Harry, your letters were 3 sentences long." The shortest one just said, she reached into her bag, because of course she'd kept it, "I'm fine. The Dursleys are being normal. Tell Ron I got his package." That's it. That's the entire letter. That covers the relevant information. "That covers absolutely none of the relevant information," she said, but not unkindly. The thing was, Harry knew they were worried. He'd known all summer, in the peripheral way you know things you're not quite ready to look at directly. Their letters had been longer than his, fuller, more carefully designed to pull him out of whatever place he'd retreated to. He hadn't been able to meet them where they were trying to go. It wasn't that he didn't want to, it was that the wanting itself felt dull, like someone had wrapped it in cotton wool. He turned back to the window. The countryside was very green and very fast, hedgerows and farmhouses strobing past in the mid-morning sun. "I just need to get back to school," he said. "I'll be better once we're back." Hermione made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite argument and opened her book. Ron finished his chocolate frog, examined the card, got Dumbledore again, that's 6, and conjured himself a comfortable lean against the window by the simple expedient of propping both feet on the seat beside Harry and slouching deeply. They sat in the easy quiet of people who know each other well enough to not need to fill silences. It lasted about 40 minutes, which was when Harry first noticed that the heaviness in his chest had started to move. It was a strange sensation, not painful exactly, more like pressure, like something shifting in a space that was too small for it. He pressed a hand flat against his sternum without really thinking about it, and Hermione looked up from her book. "Harry?" "Fine," he said. "Automatic." But it wasn't, quite. The feeling was spreading now, outward from his chest and down his arms, a slow crawling sensation like pins and needles except deeper, like it was in the bones rather than the skin. He flexed his fingers and they felt clumsy and unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. That's new, he thought, with the detached observation of someone whose brain hadn't fully committed to processing the situation as serious yet. "Harry, you've gone very pale," Hermione said, and she'd closed the book now, which was meaningful. "Fine." The words came out slightly slurred, and that was when Harry became genuinely alarmed, because his mouth was doing something his brain wasn't fully in charge of, and the pins and needles had reached his jaw. "Ron," Hermione said, in a tone that moved Ron from horizontal to upright in under a second. "What's, Harry, mate, what's?" The pressure in his chest spiked. Not pain, something bigger than pain, something that felt like a rubber band stretched to the absolute limit of its endurance pulling tight across his entire magical core, and Harry had just enough time to think, "Oh, that's what that is," before his vision went white at the edges and then gray at the center and then just, gone. He was aware, distantly, of the floor. The carpet of the compartment was scratchy against his cheek, a detail his brain chose to focus on while more important things processed in the background. He could hear Ron's voice, loud, urgent, completely unlike his usual unflappable drawl, shouting something about getting help, and Hermione was kneeling beside him saying his name with a kind of controlled precision that he recognized as her fear management voice, the one she used when panicking was not going to help and she was choosing not to do it. He tried to tell her he was fine. Nothing came out. That's concerning, he thought, and then thinking got harder. The next coherent thing was light, bright, fluorescent, nothing like the warm golden light of the train. Ceiling tiles. Harry stared at ceiling tiles and worked through the information available to him. He was lying down, he was cold, there was a smell like antiseptic and dittany, and someone nearby was speaking in the rapid, clipped vocabulary of a healer relaying information to a colleague. Magical core collapse, partial, came in with 2 friends who say he was symptomatic for approximately, duration of existing suppression. A pause. That's the thing. Come look at this. St. Mungo's. He was in St. Mungo's. Harry turned his head, which took more effort than it should have, and confirmed this by the pale green walls and the general overwhelming medical cleanliness of the place. A privacy curtain had been drawn around his bed. On the other side of it he could hear Ron's voice, still pitched at the slightly too loud register of genuine anxiety, and Hermione's quieter murmur in response. A healer appeared in his peripheral vision, young, mid-30s, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and green robes and a diagnostic wand already active, its tip glowing amber. "Mr. Potter. I'm Healer Cassius Pye. Can you hear me?" "Yes," Harry said. His voice came out as a scrape. "Can you tell me your name and today's date?" "Harry Potter. September 1st. He paused. "What happened?" "You had a partial magical core collapse." Healer Pye was watching his diagnostic wand with extreme focus, the kind that meant he was seeing something he hadn't expected. "It means your magical core was, stressed, to put it simply, beyond its sustainable threshold, and it began to shut down non-essential functions to protect itself." "I've been stressed before," Harry said. "I didn't collapse." "I don't mean emotionally stressed," Pye said carefully. He lowered the wand, and his expression had shifted from medical professional neutral to something more cautious. "Mr. Potter, have you had any unusual spells cast on you recently? Any contact with experimental magic? Any, to your knowledge, unsanctioned magical modifications to your core?" Harry stared at him. "No." Pye looked at the other healer, a woman, older, with silver-streaked hair and reading spectacles that magnified her eyes to an owlish degree. She was holding a scroll of diagnostic parchment and looking at it the way you look at something you've read 3 times because you can't quite believe it says what it says. "We need to run the full layer detection scan," she said. "Not a question." "Already running," Pi confirmed. He turned back to Harry. "Mr. Potter, I want you to stay very still and try to relax. I know that's a strange request given the circumstances, but the scan is sensitive, and I need your magical core as settled as possible." "What are you looking for?" Harry asked. There was a brief, communicative pause between the 2 healers that Harry clocked instantly because he'd spent his entire life learning to read the spaces in adult conversations where information was being deliberately withheld from him. "We'll explain everything once we have full results," Pi said. Which was not an answer. Harry lay still and stared at the ceiling and felt the diagnostic wand moving in slow, deliberate circles above his chest, and tried to quiet the thing in him that had started paying very close attention. Ron got in to see him about 20 minutes later, which suggested that Ron had been arguing with the nursing staff for the full 20 minutes and had eventually won on grounds of sheer persistence. He came through the curtain red-faced and slightly breathless, and he stood at the foot of Harry's bed and looked at him with an expression that was doing its level best to be casual and completely failing. "You scared the bloody hell out of me," he said. "Sorry." "Don't apologize, just," Ron ran a hand through his hair. "You went down like a building. No warning. Just bang, on the floor." "I did have about 30 seconds of warning," Harry said. "I just thought it was, you thought it was fine." "In my defense, there is no defense," Ron said, dropping into the chair beside the bed with the air of someone whose legs had been waiting for an opportunity to stop working. "Hermione's out there arguing with some administrator about medical privacy protocols and whether we qualify as next of kin under the Magical Families Act." "Do we?" "She says yes. She's found a subsection." Ron almost smiled. "She's been out there for 15 minutes and she's already found a subsection." Harry felt something warm move through him at that, actually warm, not muffled, not distant, which was interesting because for the past 2 months warmth had been the thing that felt most consistently out of reach. Maybe it was the absence of whatever had been pressing on his chest. He felt, if he was honest, better than he had in months. Lighter. Like something that had been wound too tight had finally been allowed to unwind. Which was, he was beginning to think, probably not a coincidence. "Ron," he said. "Yeah. The healers keep asking me about spells cast on me. About unsanctioned modifications to my magical core." Ron frowned. "What kind of modifications?" "They won't tell me yet. They're running some kind of scan." Harry paused. "But they looked at the first results and called for a full scan, which makes me think the first results showed something." Ron was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" "Right now, I mean." Harry thought about it seriously. "Better than I have in months," he said. "Weirdly better. Like, you know when you've had a headache so long you've stopped registering it as a headache, it's just normal, and then it goes away." "Yeah. Like that. But bigger." Ron stared at him, and Harry watched the implication of that land behind his eyes, and Ron's expression went through several stages in quick succession, confusion, then comprehension, then a specific type of anger that was very quiet and very Ron. "Something's been on you," Ron said. "Not a question. That's what I'm thinking." The curtain moved. Not Ron or Hermione, Healer Pi, with the older healer behind him, and both of them with expressions that had clearly been arranged into something professionally composed but hadn't fully gotten there. Pi was holding a long scroll of diagnostic parchment, and the older healer, her badge said Healer in Charge Miriam Strout, was carrying a second scroll that she was gripping with both hands. "Mr. Weasley," Pi said, "I'm going to need to ask you to step out for just a moment." "He stays," Harry said. Pi looked at him. "He stays," Harry said again, and said it in a way that was perfectly even and not remotely aggressive but communicated with complete clarity that this was not a negotiation. Pi glanced at Strout. Strout gave the smallest of nods. Very well, Pi said. He pulled the second chair to Harry's bedside, and Strout positioned herself at the foot of the bed, and for a moment nobody said anything, and Harry thought, here it is. Whatever this is, here it comes. The layered detection scan, Pi began, is a diagnostic tool designed to identify any external magical constructs embedded in or attached to a patient's magical core. It works in layers, hence the name, moving from the surface-level attachments inward, cataloging each construct by type, age, origin signature, and intent classification. How many did you find? Harry asked. Pi looked at him steadily. 35. The number sat in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water. Ron said, very quietly, 35 what? 35 distinct magical constructs embedded in or directly attached to Harry's magical core, Pi said, and his voice was careful and unhurried in the way that medical professionals learn to be when delivering information that might cause the patient to react badly. Ranging in type from standard tracking charms, relatively benign, designed to monitor his location, to more complex constructs including emotional dampeners, a suppression web targeting the upper threshold of his magical output, 2 compulsion-adjacent charms that fall into a legal gray area, and 1 construct that the scan classified as a loyalty-binding charm, which is categorically illegal under Section 14 of the Magical Regulation and Control Act. Silence. Harry's face had not moved. He was very still, the way water goes still right before something heavy breaks the surface. And the origin signature? Harry said. You said the scan shows origin signature. Healer Strout unrolled her scroll. Her voice was measured and precise and completely impossible to read. All 35 constructs share a single origin signature, she said. They all trace back to the same magical source. Which is? She looked at him over her enormous spectacles. The origin anchor for all 35 constructs is located in Albus Dumbledore's office at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Ron was on his feet. Harry wasn't sure when that had happened. Ron was standing and his face was doing something Harry had never quite seen it do before, a specific, focused, white-hot version of his anger, the kind that didn't shout, which was, in Harry's experience, far more dangerous than the kind that did. Harry himself had not moved. He was thinking, with extraordinary clarity, about the headache that had gone away. About the 2 months of cotton wool numbness. About the way his magic had felt like reaching through deep water. About every moment of passive compliance, every time he'd stepped back from a ledge he might otherwise have walked off, every moment of inexplicable, deflating exhaustion right at the point where he might have pushed back, pushed harder, pushed at all. He was thinking about Sirius, and the way he'd gone to the Department of Mysteries without hesitation, without strategy, without the capacity for the kind of cold calculation that might have made him stop and question the vision. About whether that capacity had been available to him. About whether something had been making sure it wasn't. He thought all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, I need to see the full catalog. Pi handed him the scroll. Harry read it the way he read exam questions, start to finish, methodically, without rushing. 35 constructs itemized by number, each with its type, estimated age, magical classification, and a brief description of its function. He read it all. He did not speak while he read it. Ron was pacing. He'd been pacing for the last 5 minutes and showed no signs of stopping. Hermione had come in during the handover of the scroll. She'd taken one look at the room, at Harry's face, at Ron's pacing, at the healer's careful blankness, and sat down on the edge of the second chair and waited, because Hermione always knew when to wait. The silence stretched. Harry reached the bottom of the scroll. He set it down on the bed with great care, smoothed the end of it flat with one hand, and then said nothing for a long moment. The suppressors, he said finally. Numbers 7, 8, and 9 on the list. Targeting upper threshold magical output. What does that mean practically? Pi leaned forward. It means they were calibrated to prevent your magical output from exceeding a certain level. Any significant surge, in a high-stress situation, in a powerful casting scenario, in any context where your magic would naturally push toward its upper threshold, would be intercepted and suppressed before it could manifest. So I couldn't have gone full power, Harry said. Even if I tried. Correct. For how long? Pi looked at the scroll. Construct 7 has an estimated age of 14 years. Constructs 8 and 9 were layered on top of it at ages 11 and 13 respectively, progressively strengthened as your natural magical output increased with age. Since I was 2, Harry said. Approximately. So my entire life, Harry said. Not angry. Just getting the picture right. Hermione made a small, sharp sound, like something had just broken in her chest. The emotional dampeners, Harry said. Numbers 12 through 18. Strout answered this time. They work on a simple feedback principle. High-intensity emotions, anger, grief, intense fear, trigger a dampening effect that reduces the emotional signal before it can feed into your magical response. The effect would have felt like cotton wool, Harry said. Like things that should have hit hard not quite landing. Yes. So whenever something happened that should have made me angry enough to do something about it, Harry's voice was steady, there was something making sure I didn't get angry enough. Not eliminating the emotion, Pi clarified. Reducing its intensity. Making you more manageable. More inclined toward compliance. Right, Harry said. Harry, Hermione said, and her voice was very careful, we need to, number 22, Harry said. The loyalty binding charm. The illegal one. How does that work? It was Strout who answered, and she answered with the precision of someone who wants to make absolutely certain the information lands correctly. A loyalty binding charm creates a subtle but persistent bias in the subject's magical and emotional instincts toward a specific person or institution. It doesn't override free will entirely, it's not an imperious curse. It's more insidious than that. It makes certain figures feel instinctively trustworthy. It makes certain decisions feel instinctively wrong. It creates an emotional architecture that favors compliance with the bound party. Albus Dumbledore, Harry said. The binding signature matches the others. Yes. Ron had stopped pacing. He was standing very still by the curtain with his arms crossed and his jaw tight and his eyes doing something complicated and fierce. Harry refolded the scroll, slowly, and set it on the bedside table. I want copies of that scan, he said. Full copies. All diagnostic data. Of course, Pi said. I want them retained as evidence and I want a chain of custody record started from this moment. Pi blinked. You're familiar with, my godfather was imprisoned without trial for 12 years, Harry said flatly. I know how fast things disappear in the wizarding legal system when powerful people want them to. I want the copies made now, in front of witnesses, and I want a set held by the hospital's independent records office and a set given to me. There was a short silence. Then Healer Strout said, with something that might have been approval behind the professional mask, I'll have the records office come up immediately. She left. Pi looked at Harry for a moment with an expression Harry couldn't quite name, not pity, not quite admiration, something between them. Mr. Potter, he said quietly, there's one more thing from the scan I need to tell you. Tell me. The suppression web, the one on your magical output, it had been maintaining itself under pressure for a long time. Years of your natural magical development pushing against it. What happened on the train wasn't random. The construct began to destabilize approximately 6 weeks ago. The collapse today was, in a sense, your magic breaking free. The suppression failing. Harry sat with that for a moment. So it was already failing. Yes. And once it begins to fail, the rest of the network destabilizes with it. The constructs are interconnected, designed to operate as a system. When the suppressors started to go, the whole network came under stress. That's what caused the collapse. So the collapse was my magic fighting back, Harry said. Essentially, yes. Harry nodded once, slowly. How do I feel right now? He asked. Compared to how I should feel, I mean. Without the constructs. Pi's expression did something complicated. The destabilization took most of the network down. A few minor constructs are still partially active, we'll need to formally remove them, and I'd recommend a full restorative treatment for your core, but broadly speaking. What you're feeling right now is your unimpeded magical baseline for the first time since you were approximately 2 years old. Harry looked at his own hands. He turned them over, palm up, and felt the magic in them, actually felt it, present and immediate, not behind glass. Like finally being in the room rather than watching it through a window. It's a lot, he said. It is, Pi agreed. You're exceptionally powerful, Mr. Potter. Probably in a range that would qualify as, he stopped himself, then said, carefully, significant. Ron let out a breath that was half a laugh. Mate. Yeah, Harry said. He picked up the scroll again, turned it over in his hands. Has the Ministry been notified? Illegal magical constructs of this severity, we're required to report them, Strout said, reappearing through the curtain. She had the hospital records officer with her, a small wizard in grey robes with a badge and a certification quill. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was contacted while I was arranging your copies. Good, Harry said. Hermione, who had been so quiet that Harry had almost forgotten she was there, said suddenly, Harry, and her voice cracked on the single syllable in a way that made him look at her sharply. She was holding herself very carefully. Her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set, and she was doing the thing she did when she was angry in the way that went deep, not surface-hot anger but the kind that came from something having been wrong for a long time and her only just finding out about it. I'm all right, he said. You've been living with 35 charms on your magical core for your entire life, she said. You've been, she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Restarted. The things you should have felt that you were prevented from feeling. The things you might have done if your magic hadn't been suppressed. The decisions you might have made differently if a loyalty charm hadn't been, she stopped again. Hermione. I trusted him, she said, and it was barely above a whisper and it carried the weight of everything that meant coming from her specifically, coming from someone for whom trust in authority had been central and foundational and real. I defended his decisions. To you. Multiple times. I told you to trust him. You didn't know, Harry said. That's not, she shook her head. That's not the point. Harry looked at her for a long moment. It kind of is, though, he said. Nobody in this room put those charms on me. And I need everyone in this room right now. So. Hermione pressed the back of her hand to her mouth briefly. Then she nodded, once, sharp, and the brightness in her eyes went from grief to something harder and more purposeful, and Harry thought, there she is. Right, she said. Then we start with the legal documentation. I know magical law enforcement has been notified, but we should also contact the Wisengamot Ethics Committee directly, because the DMLE can be pressured by the Wisengamot and the Wisengamot has historically, Hermione, Ron said. What? Can you do that in, 30 minutes? Because I think Harry should eat something first. You basically died, Ron told Harry, with the directness of someone who has been very frightened and is covering it with practicality. You need a sandwich. Harry almost laughed. Actually almost, the laugh sat right there, real and accessible, right at the surface where it hadn't been in months. Yeah, he said. Okay. Sandwich first. The records officer was thorough and silent and efficient, and by the time he was done Harry had 4 copies of the full diagnostic scan in a charmed folder that would flag any unauthorized access. Pi administered the removal of the remaining minor constructs, a slightly uncomfortable process that felt like having splinters pulled from somewhere inside his chest, and prescribed a 3-day course of magical core restoration potions that Harry agreed to take mostly to get out of the clinical discussion faster. The hospital was quiet in the late afternoon way that hospitals go quiet, the bustle of the day settling into the hum of ongoing care, voices muffled, footsteps echoing on linoleum. Harry sat up in the hospital bed in his regular clothes because nobody had suggested a hospital gown and he hadn't asked for one, and ate the sandwich that Ron had obtained from somewhere, the hospital canteen, probably. Ron had a gift for locating food in any environment, and felt the strangeness of his own body. He felt real. That was the only word for it. Present and solid and real, like he'd been living at a slight remove from himself for so long that the removal had become the baseline, and now the baseline had shifted and everything was brighter and louder and more immediate and he wasn't sure yet whether it was overwhelming or just true. Probably just true. Hermione had her notebook out and was building what was clearly going to be a comprehensive legal strategy from scratch, her handwriting quick and sharp, occasionally muttering to herself about subsections. Ron was sitting sideways in his chair with his legs over the arm, which was technically not how chairs were supposed to be used and which the nursing staff had failed to dislodge him from despite 2 attempts. "She's going to have a 20-page brief by morning," Ron said, nodding toward Hermione. 30, Hermione said without looking up. She said 30. I heard her. Just want to be clear that you heard her say 30, because I want you to appreciate, Ron. I'm appreciating. Out loud. Harry finished his sandwich. Looked at the folder with the diagnostic copies. Looked at his hands. In the corridor outside, beyond the privacy curtain, he could hear 2 healers speaking in low, urgent tones, and one of them said a name, said Dumbledore, and the conversation dropped to something below audibility, and Harry thought, he already knows. Or he will soon. He thought about what Dumbledore would say. He could construct the conversation with remarkable clarity. He knew the cadences, the gentle certainty, the blue eyes and the half-moon spectacles and the way that every explanation was framed as something being done for Harry rather than to him. The greater good, wrapped in affection. The long game, played on a board Harry hadn't known he was sitting on. He wasn't angry, he realized. He tested the space where anger should be and found something cooler and more deliberate. He was awake. He was looking at things he'd previously looked past or looked away from and seeing them clearly for the first time, without the emotional dampening that had been filing off the sharp edges. And what he saw, clearly, with full resolution, was a lifetime of decisions made for him. Managed. Monitored. Modulated. He reached over and picked up the folder. Hermione, he said. First thing tomorrow. Who's the most reliable, most independent person in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement? Someone who can't be pressured, can't be bought, and won't bury this. Hermione looked up. Something in his voice had shifted, she heard it immediately, he could tell. Amelia Bones, she said, without hesitating. Head of the DMLE. She's the one who gave you a fair hearing after the Dementor incident. She runs her department independently and she's on record as being resistant to Dumbledore's influence in the Wizengamot. Bones, Harry repeated. Yes. All right. Harry stood up. He felt the floor under his feet with unusual clarity, every muscle in his body working the way muscles were supposed to work, his magic sitting in him like something that had come home. Then let's make sure Amelia Bones has everything she needs. He held the folder for a moment, and through the thin walls of the private room he could hear the hospital going about its business, and somewhere outside London was going about its business, and somewhere in Scotland a school that was about to start its year had an old man in a tower office with 35 threads leading from it to a boy who was no longer, not even slightly, willing to be held by them. Harry looked at Ron. Ron looked back at him, steady and present and completely, unhesitatingly there. Okay, Ron said. Just that. But the word was load-bearing. Harry picked up his wand. It felt different, not the wand, but the hand holding it. The connection between them. The aliveness of it. Let's go, he said. Chapter 2, 35 The Department of Magical Law Enforcement occupied the second level of the Ministry of Magic, and at 7:30 in the morning it smelled like strong tea, old parchment, and the particular anxious energy of people who knew their day was going to be difficult before it had properly started. Harry had been awake since 4. Not because of nightmares, which was itself unusual enough to notice. He'd lain in a narrow hospital bed listening to Ron's breathing even out into sleep across the room and felt the quality of his own wakefulness as something sharp and purposeful rather than the grinding, joyless insomnia he'd grown accustomed to. His mind had been moving. Sorting. Building. By 5 he'd had a plan. By 6 he'd had Hermione's input on the plan, because Hermione had also been awake since somewhere around 4:30 and had greeted him across the dark room with, "I've been thinking about the Wisengamot's conflict of interest problem," which told him everything he needed to know about how her night had gone. They'd eaten the hospital's early breakfast, porridge, toast, tea so strong it was essentially brick, and gone over everything 3 times. Hermione had produced, as promised, 23 pages of handwritten notes organized into sections with a color-coded index. Ron had eaten 4 pieces of toast and provided what he described as moral support and what was actually, Harry reflected, the most useful kind of presence, someone who wasn't second-guessing, wasn't catastrophizing, was simply there and steady and ready. The DMLE was not technically open to civilian visitors at 7:30. The administrator at the front desk, a thin witch with her hair in a complicated knot, had opened her mouth to explain this when Harry placed the charmed folder on her desk and said, "My name is Harry Potter and I have a St. Mungo's diagnostic record documenting 35 illegal and unsanctioned magical constructs removed from my body yesterday, all tracing to a single origin point. I'd like to see Amelia Bones." The administrator closed her mouth. Then she picked up the folder, looked at the St. Mungo's seal on the front, looked at Harry's face, specifically at the scar, and said, "One moment," in a voice that had taken on a new quality entirely. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said, "Director Bones will see you now," and her tone suggested that the director had said this with some urgency. Amelia Bones's office was not what Harry had expected, which was somehow both larger and more spare than he'd imagined. No decorative clutter, no status objects, no portraits angling for his attention. A desk that was clearly a working desk rather than a symbol of authority, covered in actual documents, actual evidence folders, an actual half-eaten biscuit beside a cold cup of tea. One wall was entirely shelving. Another had a large pinboard covered in what looked like an active case map. She was standing when they came in, which Harry also hadn't expected. Mid-50s, square-jawed, with short iron gray hair and a monocle that she wore like most people wore reading glasses, habitually, unself-consciously, as a tool rather than an affectation. She was wearing DMLE robes that had seen real use. She looked like someone who had been at her desk since 6 and intended to be there until 9 at night and hadn't particularly agonized over that fact. She looked at Harry with the same direct, assessing look she'd given him at his hearing the previous year, not warm exactly, but fair. Interested in the actual truth of things. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Sit down." They sat, Harry, Hermione, Ron ranged across the 3 chairs in front of her desk. Bones remained standing for a moment, looking at the folder that her administrator had passed to her. "St. Mungo's contacted my department last night," she said. "I had a preliminary report on my desk at 10 p.m. "Did you read it?" Harry asked. 3 times. She set the folder down and finally sat, leaning back in her chair with her fingers steepled. "I want to hear it from you first. Before we go into the documentation, before we start the formal process, I want to hear what happened, in your words." So Harry told her. He was concise and specific, which he suspected she appreciated. He started with the train and ended with the folder, and he didn't editorialize or perform distress or give her the version of events designed to generate sympathy, he just told her what happened and what had been found. Hermione added the legal citations twice, both times seamlessly, the way a good second chair does. Ron said nothing but managed to communicate throughout that he was fully prepared to corroborate every word. When Harry finished, Bones was quiet for a moment. 35 constructs, she said. "Yes. The oldest placed when you were approximately 2 years old. Healer Pye's estimate, yes." She looked at him steadily. "How are you?" Harry blinked. He hadn't been expecting that. Fine, he said, automatic. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile. I'll ask again. How are you? Not for the record. I'm asking because you've just spent a night in hospital after learning your magical core has been tampered with since infancy by the most powerful and respected wizard in Britain, and you've come to my office at 7:30 in the morning with a legal strategy already built, and I want to know if there's a human being inside all of that or if you've decided to go straight to the functional part. Harry looked at her for a moment. Probably both, he said. She nodded. That's a reasonable answer. She opened the folder. All right. Here's where we are. St. Mungo's is legally obligated to file an incident report with this office for any illegal magical construct discovered on a patient. That report triggers an automatic investigation under Section 27 of the Magical Regulation and Control Act. I cannot shelve it even if someone asked me to. Would someone ask you to? Someone will, she said, with the calm certainty of long experience. Not yet, and probably not directly. But yes. And when they do? I'll tell them what I always tell people who ask me to shelve things they don't like, she said. No. Ron made a small sound that might have been approval. Bones opened the diagnostic scroll, flattened it on her desk, and examined it with the same methodical focus she'd been giving everything else. Harry watched her eyes move down the list. She paused at number 22, the loyalty binding charm. She paused again at constructs 7, 8, and 9. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but her jaw got slightly tighter, which Harry suspected was her equivalent of a significant reaction. The loyalty binding charm alone is grounds for criminal proceedings, she said. Section 14 is unambiguous. The deliberate application of a loyalty-binding construct without the subject's knowledge or consent is a class of magical offense. It carries a minimum of 3 years in Azkaban. The room went very quiet. The complication, Bones continued, setting down the scroll, is that the origin signature evidence, while compelling, needs to be formally verified by the Ministry's own diagnostic team before it becomes admissible in Wisengamot proceedings. The hospital scan is excellent documentation and will absolutely be part of the record, but we need an independent verification. How do we get that? Hermione asked. I convene a formal investigative panel and order a ministry diagnostic scan. That requires my authority as DMLE director plus a co-signature from either the minister or the head of the Wisengamot Ethics Committee. She paused. The minister is going to be complicated. Because of his relationship with Dumbledore, Harry said. Because Cornelius Fudge has spent the last year telling every publication in Britain that Albus Dumbledore is a power-hungry manipulator trying to destabilize the Ministry, Bones said, with dry precision, and will now need to decide whether his personal animosity toward Dumbledore is worth more or less than his political debt to the Wisengamot Old Guard who are very loyal to Dumbledore and whose support he needs. He will be paralyzed for at least 48 hours. The Ethics Committee head, Hermione said. Alpheus Doge. He's a close personal friend of Dumbledore's. He would never co-sign. Doge is the standing head, yes. Bones looked at Hermione with something that was definitely approval. However, the deputy head is Griselda Marchbanks, who is currently not on speaking terms with Dumbledore following a Wisengamot vote in March, who has publicly stated that institutional accountability applies to everyone regardless of status, and who signed off on the independent examination of Harry's case last year without hesitation. So we go to Marchbanks, Harry said. I go to Marchbanks, Bones corrected. Procedurally, this is my investigation. You are the victim and the complainant. What you can do is provide me with everything you have, formally submit your account as a witness testimony, and let this office do its job. She looked at him steadily. I know that's difficult for someone who's used to handling things themselves. I'll manage, Harry said. I thought you might. She reached into her desk and produced a clean testimony scroll and a self-inking quill. The formal testimony process takes about an hour. After that, I want you to return to St. Mungo's and complete the core restoration treatment Healer Pie recommended. Not optional, she added, before Harry could speak. You are the central piece of evidence in this investigation, Mr. Potter, which means your health is materially relevant to this case. She's using the case to get you to take care of yourself, Ron said, in a low aside. I heard that, Mr. Weasley, Bones said, without looking up from the testimony scroll she was preparing. I assumed you would, Ron said, looking not remotely chastened. The testimony took 93 minutes. Bones asked questions with precision, not aggressive, not gentle, simply exact. What did you feel? When did you first notice? Have you experienced this symptom previously? She had a quick notes quill running throughout and she paused the formal record twice to say, off the record, and ask him something human and then restarted without marking the transition, which Harry appreciated. By the time they finished the sun was fully up and the department had populated around them, aurors moving through the bullpen beyond Bones's glass partition, owls arriving and departing, the general hum of institutional machinery that Harry usually found deeply alienating and today found merely functional. Things were moving. That was the point. They came out of the DMLE into the main ministry atrium and found it considerably busier than it had been at 7:30. Harry understood why when he noticed people looking at him. Not the usual staring, not the celebrity recognition stare he'd learned to navigate, the double take and the whisper to a neighbor. This was different. More pointed. Several people were holding copies of the Daily Prophet, and one woman dropped hers entirely when she saw his face, and Harry thought, oh no. What does it say? He said. Ron grabbed the dropped paper before its owner could retrieve it, scanned the headline, and made a face. How did they get it this fast? Hermione took it from him and went pale. Harry took it from her. The headline read, Boy Who Lived Collapses. Illegal magic found on Harry Potter's magical core, source traced to Hogwarts. The subheading read, Exclusive, St. Mungo's sources confirm 35 constructs, including suppression charms and loyalty-binding spell. The hospital has a leak, Ron said. Hospitals always have leaks, Hermione said, and her voice was doing the tight, controlled thing it did when she was genuinely furious. They were supposed to maintain confidentiality until, it doesn't matter, Harry said. Both of them looked at him. He was reading the article with the same steady focus he'd applied to the diagnostic scroll. Not panicking. Assessing. The article was, surprisingly accurate, actually, for the Prophet. The journalist had clearly gotten the information from someone with genuine access to the preliminary hospital report rather than from speculation. The details about the loyalty-binding charm were there. The origin signature was there, described as, traced to a source within Hogwarts School, carefully not naming Dumbledore directly, though the implication was a doorway you could drive a thestral through. Rita Skeeter wrote it, Hermione said, over his shoulder, and the disgust in her voice was specific and personal. At least she got the facts right for once, Harry said. That's the worst part, Hermione said. She usually doesn't, so when she does it's almost more alarming. Harry folded the paper and handed it back to the woman who dropped it, who stared at him like she wasn't sure whether to apologize or ask for a quote. Could you? The woman started. Not right now, Harry said, not unkindly, and kept walking. The atrium was filling up with the particular electric quality of a building that has just received news it doesn't know what to do with. Harry moved through it and felt people's attention tracking him and felt, with some surprise, that it didn't feel the way it usually did. Usually the attention felt heavy, like something pressing on him, like an obligation he'd failed to adequately prepare for. Now it just felt like attention. External. Not his problem. Something the dampening charms had been doing to him, probably, making other people's opinions land harder than they should, making the weight of expectation more bearable by making his own capacity for resistance less available. He thought about that, and felt the clean sharp edge of a specific anger, the first really clean emotion he'd felt in months, and let himself have it. Back at the hospital, Harry sat through the core restoration treatment with better grace than he'd expected, which mostly involved lying still while Healer Pie ran a specialized restorative process that felt warm and slightly strange, like something being carefully untangled. Hermione had stationed herself at a small table in the corner of the room with her notes spread out, working. Ron had gone to contact his parents. "The Prophet article," Harry said to the ceiling, while Pi worked. "Yes," Pi said, not looking up from what he was doing. "I want you to know that the leak didn't come from this team." "I know. We have an internal investigation." "I know," Harry said. "It's all right. The information was going to come out. The method was unfortunate, but the outcome is, probably not unhelpful." Pi paused briefly. "You're quite strategic for 16. "I've had to be," Harry said. "Yes," Pi said quietly. "I suppose you have." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Pi resumed working. "The dampening charms," Harry said. Number 12 through 18. "They affected emotional response, reduced intensity." "Yes. What about the compulsion-adjacent ones?" Numbers 24 and 25. "You listed them as legally gray area." Pi was quiet for a moment. "They sit in a classification space between a mild compulsion and a strong suggestibility charm. They were calibrated to increase your tendency to defer to authority, to accept instructions from figures of established trust, and to discount your own instinctive resistance to directives you might otherwise push back on." Harry absorbed this. "So when my instinct was to push back and I didn't," he said. "That wasn't just me being." "No," Pi said. "It was not just you. And when I went along with plans I wasn't sure about because someone I trusted seemed confident, the charms would have amplified that dynamic significantly." "Yes." Harry stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Thought about the Chamber of Secrets. The Triwizard Tournament. The Ministry last year. Every time he'd had an instinct, a sharp, clear "this is wrong," and been talked out of it, or simply found his own conviction strangely soft when it should have been solid. "Can I ask you something?" Pi said. "Go ahead." "Does it help? Knowing the reason? Or does it make things more complicated?" Harry thought about it honestly. "Both," he said. "It makes things clearer and it makes me want to go back over everything and figure out which decisions were mine. Which is probably a project." "Probably," Pi agreed. "But it doesn't change what happens now," Harry said. "That part's simpler." The restoration ended 20 minutes later. Pi ran the diagnostic wand over Harry's core one more time, checked the results, and said, "Clean," with the satisfied economy of someone confirming a theory. He made notes. Handed Harry the completion documentation. "Your magical core is fully intact and unimpeded," he said. "I do want to see you again in a week for a follow-up. The core has been operating under suppression for so long that there may be an adjustment period as it settles into its natural range." "What should I expect?" "More power than you're used to, particularly in emotionally charged moments. A stronger than average connection to your wand. Potentially some unusual manifestations while the core calibrates, accidental magic beyond what you'd normally be capable of." He paused. "Try to stay calm. In the middle of an investigation into illegal magic cast on me by Dumbledore," Harry said. "Yes," Pi said, with the air of someone who appreciates the absurdity of their own medical advice. Molly Weasley arrived at 2 in the afternoon like weather. She came through the door with Ron slightly behind her at a pace that left no doubt about the character of her approach, and she took one look at Harry sitting up in the hospital bed with a folder of legal documents and immediately crossed the room and gathered him into a hug that was less an embrace and more a physical declaration of intent. Harry, who was generally poor at being hugged, allowed it and then found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't particularly want it to end. "You wonderful, terrible child," she said into the top of his head. "Why didn't you tell us you were ill?" "Why didn't you, Mum?" Ron said. "Don't mum me, Ronald, he spent 2 months feeling awful and didn't tell anyone, he didn't know why," Ron said. She pulled back and looked at Harry's face, and her expression was complicated, furious in the way that concerned mothers are furious, which is a very specific type that contains more love than anger but deploys the anger as its delivery mechanism. Her eyes were bright. "How are you?" she asked. "Better," Harry said. "Actually better. Not the automatic kind." She cupped his face in one hand briefly. "Arthur's at the ministry. He went in as soon as we got the owl. He's trying to find out what they're doing about." She stopped. The door had opened again, and Arthur Weasley came through it with an expression that conveyed significant information before he said a word. He was pale, and his eyes had the particular focused look of someone who has just been in a room where very important things were said very quickly. "Dumbledore's been to the ministry," Arthur said, closing the door behind him. The room went quiet. "Already?" Hermione said. "About an hour ago. He requested a private meeting with the minister." Arthur looked at Harry directly. Cornelius didn't refuse the meeting, but Amelia Bones apparently found out about it and inserted herself. "I have a source in the minister's outer office." "What happened?" Harry asked. "From what I understand, Dumbledore offered an explanation." Arthur pulled up a chair and sat. He was choosing his words with care, which was unusual for him. Arthur Weasley's default register was warm and occasionally bumbling and fundamentally transparent. Right now he was being deliberate. He did not deny placing the constructs. He characterized them as protective measures. The room was very quiet. "Protective measures," Harry said. He used the word protective several times, from what I'm told. He framed the tracking charms as necessary for monitoring your safety given Voldemort's interest in you. He framed the suppression constructs as, Arthur stopped. "As what?" Harry asked. "As safeguards," Arthur said quietly. "Against the possibility that your power, unregulated, might attract dark forces or inadvertently enable dark magic." He cited the connection between you and, he hesitated. "Voldemort," Harry finished. "He said my power needed to be suppressed in case the connection with Voldemort was a channel for dark magic." Arthur looked at him with something that was almost painful to look at, sorrow, and anger, and the particular helplessness of someone who had believed a narrative and is now watching it disassemble in real time. "Yes. The loyalty charm," Ron said, and his voice was flat. "What was his explanation for the loyalty charm?" A longer silence. "He characterized it as a stabilizing measure, ensuring Harry's trust in his primary guardian during a period of extreme danger." Ron stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and his shoulders were a very particular shape that Harry recognized as Ron doing what he did when he was angry past a certain threshold, removing himself from the center of the room before he said something he couldn't take back. "He was in the meeting for 45 minutes, Arthur continued. Bones held her position throughout. She told Dumbledore that explanations and justifications are separate from legality, and that regardless of intent, the application of a loyalty-binding charm without consent is a Class A offense and she intended to proceed accordingly." "Good," Harry said. "Dumbledore asked to speak with you," Arthur said. Harry looked at him. "He requested a private meeting. He sent the request through the minister's office, addressed to you, to be relayed through your current guardians." Arthur paused. "He cited his guardianship of your welfare as, he's not my guardian," Harry said. "Legally, he's not my guardian," Harry said, and it wasn't sharp, wasn't raised, but it was absolute in a way that stopped Arthur mid-sentence. "The Dursleys are my legal guardians. They are terrible at it, but they are the legal designation. Dumbledore has no formal guardianship claim on me, and after what we found yesterday I'd like to make it formally very clear that he has no informal one either." Arthur looked at him steadily. "That's what I told his intermediary." "Good. Harry," Hermione said carefully. "You may need to speak with him at some point. For the investigation, if nothing else, I'll speak with him when Amelia Bones has a formal investigative hearing scheduled and I have a legal representative at my side," Harry said. "Not before." Hermione's expression shifted, checking for signs of the compulsion charm's influence. Harry suspected, the reflexive over-deference to authority that they'd created. Then she registered what he'd actually said, not a refusal to deal with it, but a structured, legally protected, strategically sound approach to it, and something in her face settled. "Right," she said. "We should find you a solicitor." "Gemma Farley," Arthur said immediately. Everyone looked at him. He went slightly pink. "I asked around before I came here. Just in case. She's the best magical law specialist in London. She handled the Greengrass estate case 3 years ago and she is not intimidated by institutional figures." "How do we reach her?" Harry asked. Arthur produced a card from his coat pocket with the slightly sheepish speed of someone who had hoped the moment would arise. "I may have already told her this morning." "Arthur," Molly said. "Someone had to be practical," he said. Harry looked at the card. Plain white, clean lettering, Gemma Farley, magical law specialist. Independent practice. He turned it over. On the back, in cramped handwriting that Harry recognized as Arthur's, "She'll see you this afternoon if you can make it to her chambers by 4. I told her it was urgent." "It's 2 o'clock, Harry said. "You have time to eat something first," Molly said, in a tone that did not invite argument. "I've already told the canteen." "You've already told I've been here for 20 minutes, Harry." Gemma Farley's chambers were in Diagon Alley above Flourish and Blots, accessed by an unmarked side door and a narrow staircase that took you up 4 flights before opening into a set of rooms that were clean, organized, and smelled like law, which Harry had decided was a combination of parchment, ink, and the specific metallic note of binding magic on official documents. Farley herself was tall, early 40s, with sharp-featured face, dark hair pulled back with professional efficiency, and the bearing of someone who had long since stopped caring whether she was the most comfortable person in the room as long as she was the most prepared. She met Harry with a handshake that was brisk and equal, with no fussing over the scar, no special adjustment in her manner that said "You're famous," just a crisp "Mr. Potter, sit down, let's get to it" that Harry found immediately refreshing. Hermione had come with him. Ron was back at the hospital with his parents, holding down what had become something of a Weasley war council. Farley had already obtained a copy of the Prophet article and the preliminary DMLE report. She read the diagnostic scroll Harry handed her with the speed of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and found it. "The loyalty binding charm is the centerpiece," she said, before Harry could speak. "Class A offense. Non-negotiable. Everything else on this list, the suppressors, the tracking charms, the compulsion-adjacent constructs, builds the picture of systematic, intentional magical interference. But the loyalty charm is the lock. What does pursuing it actually look like?" Harry asked. "Criminal proceedings before the Wizengamot, assuming DMLE Director Bones advances the investigation to that stage, which from Arthur Weasley's account this morning seems likely." She folded her hands on the desk. "I want to be honest with you about the complications. Please. Albus Dumbledore has the respect of approximately 60% of the sitting Wizengamot members. He is the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, which means he would normally preside over criminal proceedings. He will obviously recuse himself in this case, but his political capital in that chamber is enormous. Several members will be actively looking for reasons to question the evidence, the methodology, the diagnostic scan's reliability, the chain of custody. I started the chain of custody documentation at St. Mungo's the day of the scan," Harry said. "Before I even left the hospital bed." Farley stopped. I asked for 4 copies of the full diagnostic data. A chain of custody record started from that moment, a set held by the hospital's independent records office, and a set retained by me." He paused. "My godfather spent 12 years in Azkaban without a trial. I'm familiar with how evidence disappears when powerful people want it to." Farley looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she said, "You're 16. "Yes." "All right," she said, and picked up her quill. "Then we're in good shape. Here's what I need from you." She talked for 40 minutes, laying out the legal architecture with the methodical clarity of someone building a structure designed to withstand significant pressure. Harry listened carefully and asked questions that she answered without condescension, and somewhere in the middle of it Hermione started taking notes with a focused intensity that suggested she was building a parallel brief of her own, and Farley glanced at her twice with an expression that was close to affectionate. At the end, Farley set down her quill and looked at Harry. "One more thing," she said. "And this is outside the legal brief, so I'm asking you rather than telling you." "Ask. What do you want from this?" "Not what the law can give you. I know the law, that's my job." "I mean, what do you actually want?" Harry sat with the question. He'd been sitting with versions of it all day, in the spaces between the formal processes, in the quiet moments when the strategy fell away and the simple human fact of it was just there, unmediated. "I want accountability," he said. "I want it on the record, formally and permanently, what was done. I want it to be something he can't walk back or reframe or have quietly forgotten in 5 years." He paused. "And I want it done in a way that doesn't drag on for 3 years and leave every decision I make for the next decade under a cloud." "Clean and fast," Farley said. "Clean and documented," he said. "Fast would be nice, but I'm not going to sacrifice clean for it." She looked at him for another moment, and then she smiled, which was the first time she'd smiled, and it changed her face considerably. "Mr. Potter," she said, "you're going to be fine." "I know," Harry said. Outside the window, Diagon Alley was going about its early evening business, shopkeepers closing up, families moving toward the leaky cauldron, the ordinary texture of the wizarding world that had never, for as long as Harry could remember, felt entirely like a place he belonged in. He watched it for a moment. He thought about 35 threads, all running to the same point. He thought about what it meant that those threads were gone, not cut by someone else, not removed by a healer's careful work. Gone because his own magic had finally pushed hard enough to break them. That felt important. He wasn't sure yet exactly how, but it felt like something to hold on to. He stood up and picked up his copy of the diagnostic scroll, and Hermione gathered her notes, and outside the city was going quiet in the way cities go quiet, not silent, never silent, but settling, and tomorrow the ministry would open and Amelia Bones would begin the formal investigation process, and Dumbledore would make his next move, and whatever came next would come. Harry had been waiting for things his whole life. He was done with that now. Chapter 3, The Man with the Long Game. The formal hearing request arrived at Gemma Farley's chambers on Thursday morning, 2 days after Harry had sat across her desk and told her he wanted things clean and documented. It came not as the expected ministry summons but as a personal letter, written in a hand Harry recognized before he even broke the seal, looping, precise, the ink a deep blue that was almost violet. "Dear Harry, I wonder if you might allow me the courtesy of a private conversation before the formal proceedings begin. There is much I would like to explain, and much that I believe you deserve to hear directly from me rather than through the intermediary of institutional process. I am, as always, available at your convenience. Yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore." Harry read it once, set it on Farley's desk, and said, "No." Farley looked at the letter. He went around the ministry's channels. "Yes. That's actually useful," she said, picking it up carefully. "It demonstrates a preference for managing this privately rather than engaging with the formal process. I'd like to keep this." "It's yours," Harry said. He didn't feel what he might have expected to feel, looking at the handwriting, the slightly violet ink, the careful loops. No pull toward compliance, no instinctive softening. Just clarity. The letter was a move in a game, and he recognized it as one, and recognition was its own kind of power. He'd been at the Leaky Cauldron since Monday. Farley had suggested it as a neutral location while legal guardianship questions were being sorted, and Tom the barkeep had given him a room at what Harry suspected was a heavily discounted rate and had asked no questions, which Harry appreciated. Ron had come back with him, and Hermione had fled from her parents' house every morning, and the Weasleys had been a steady presence in various configurations, Molly appearing with food that hadn't been requested but was always needed, Arthur with ministry updates delivered with the efficiency of someone who had very good sources and the wisdom to know how to use them. The guardianship question was, in fact, Farley's current primary focus. Harry was 16, legally a minor, and the Dursleys were his designated guardians, a fact that had always been practically meaningless and was now additionally legally inconvenient, since Vernon Dursley's response to the owl informing him of Harry's hospitalization had been a single line on a postcard: "We cannot be contacted about the boy's affairs." The Dursley. Can they formally relinquish guardianship? Harry had asked. Oh, enthusiastically, Farley had said. The question is who takes it over. You're 16. Majority is 17 in the wizarding world. We have approximately 12 months to fill. Is there anyone suitable? The conversation had moved from there into the question of the Weasleys, who had offered immediately and loudly and with the kind of complete unanimity that left no room for doubt about where they stood. It was, legally, more complicated than the offer. Farley was working through the ministry designation process, which was designed for clear-cut cases and was having to be gently repurposed for this one. Harry had looked at Arthur and Molly's signatures on the guardianship petition and felt something move in him that he didn't quite have language for yet. Something warm and specifically new, not the dulled warmth he'd been managing on for months, but the real thing, direct and unfiltered, which apparently hit considerably harder. He'd had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Ron had pretended not to notice, which was one of Ron's great qualities. Thursday afternoon brought a development Harry hadn't expected, which arrived in the form of a knock on his room at the Leaky Cauldron at 2:30. He opened the door and found Severus Snape. Snape was not in teaching robes. He was in ordinary dark clothes that were nonetheless extremely Snape, severe cut, high collar, the general silhouette of someone who had decided years ago that they were not interested in being visually approachable. He looked exactly as he always did, which was like something that had decided to make discomfort its aesthetic. He also looked, Harry noted, like he hadn't slept. They stared at each other for a moment. "Professor," Harry said. "Potter," Snape said. His voice was its usual precise drawl, but there was something running underneath it, a current that Harry couldn't immediately name. "May I come in?" Harry stepped back from the door. Snape came in, glanced around the room with the reflexive assessment of someone who checks spaces before committing to them, and remained standing. Harry sat on the edge of the bed and waited. "I saw the prophet," Snape said. "Most people have. I want to be clear about something before we have whatever conversation this is going to be." He turned, and his eyes were direct, which was unusual. Snape usually deployed eye contact as a weapon, using it to unsettle or probe. This was different. This was someone choosing to look at something squarely. "I knew about some of the tracking charms. 3 of the standard location monitoring constructs. I was aware of them." Harry said nothing. "I was told they were safety measures. Standard monitoring for a high-value target under active threat. I was not told about their number, their scope, or their," he stopped. "I was not told about the suppression constructs. I was not told about the compulsion-adjacent charms." A pause, and his jaw tightened fractionally. "I was not told about the loyalty-binding charm." "Would it have changed anything?" Harry asked. "If you'd known." "That's the question you should be asking," Snape said, and there was something in his voice that was close to bitter but not quite. "And I have been asking it since Monday morning with a great deal of dissatisfaction at my own answers." Harry looked at him steadily. "So what are you here to tell me?" Snape pulled the chair from the small desk and sat in it with the precise movements of someone who has decided to commit to a conversation they find uncomfortable. "I am here because you will need a witness who was inside Dumbledore's circle for the past 15 years. Someone who can speak to the pattern of decisions made about you, not just the charms themselves, but the context they were placed in. The systematic nature of the management." "You're offering to testify," Harry said. "I'm offering to provide a statement to your solicitor," Snape said carefully. "Whether it becomes formal testimony is a question for Farley to determine. I am told she is competent." "She's excellent," Harry said. "Then she can advise on how to use what I know." He paused. "I am not doing this for altruistic reasons, and I am not doing it because I have any particular warmth toward you. I want to be explicit about that. I know, Harry said. I am doing it because what was done is, he stopped again, and something moved through his expression that Harry couldn't entirely read. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was more like a man confronting the edges of a thing he thought he understood and finding it considerably larger than he'd mapped. It is not something I can be comfortable having been adjacent to. And I was made a fool of, which I find intolerable. Harry suggested. Snape's eyes narrowed. Don't push your luck, Potter. Sorry. A silence. Not hostile, exactly. The room held it without particular difficulty, which was itself new. Harry had never been alone with Snape in a space that wasn't charged with active mutual antagonism. This was something else. Two people locating a common point from very different directions. The loyalty-binding charm, Harry said. Snape was very still. You knew Dumbledore's office was the origin point of whatever monitoring was on me. 3 charms, you said. Standard location monitoring. Harry kept his voice even. Did it never occur to you to wonder what else might be anchored to that same origin point? It occurred to me, Snape said, quietly. And I chose not to pursue the question. He said it flatly, without dressing it up. I am aware of what that makes me. Harry thought about that. About the choice to not ask. About how many people, across his entire life, had made the choice not to ask and had let the not asking settle into something that functioned like complicity without ever having been decided upon as such. The loyalty-binding charm was on me since I was approximately 11, Harry said. That's when they estimate it was placed, based on the construct's signature. First year. Snape's expression didn't change but his stillness intensified, became a different quality of still. I don't know exactly when in first year, Harry continued. But I know that's the year I met Dumbledore properly. And I know that's the year I started thinking of him as, he stopped. Considered his phrasing. As someone I would do things for without needing to understand why. Snape was quiet for a long time. He is not a cruel man, Snape said finally, and the words came out carefully, like he was handling something that might break or burn. That's what makes it, he genuinely believes. He has always genuinely believed that what he does is necessary. The greater good is not a cynical construction for him. He means it. I know, Harry said. That doesn't make it, I know that too. Another silence. Snape looked at him, and there was something in the look that Harry didn't have a category for in their history, a careful reassessment, not warmth, not respect exactly, but something adjacent to both, reluctant and genuine. You're handling this with more equanimity than I expected, Snape said. The dampening charms are gone, Harry said. Everything's hitting the way it's supposed to hit. But I had 2 days to sit with it before it hit full force, and I spent those 2 days building something instead of, he paused. I'd rather be building than falling apart. Falling apart is available later if I need it. Snape looked at him for a moment that stretched past casual. Your mother, he said, and stopped. What about her? She would have handled it the same way, Snape said, very quietly. Not softened, just precise. A fact being offered. She was, when something was wrong, she didn't collapse inward. She moved toward it. Harry didn't say anything. He let the silence hold what it needed to hold, which was not small. All right, he said eventually. I'll tell Farley you're available for a statement. She'll contact you. Snape stood. Straightened. Resumed the full architecture of his usual self, shoulders and jaw and controlled expression. One more thing, he said. Yeah. The suppression constructs. The ones calibrating your magical output. He looked at Harry with something that was almost clinical but wasn't quite. You understand that their removal means your actual power range is significant, Harry said, using Healer Pye's word with the specific weight Pye had given it. Considerable is the word I would use, Snape said. Probably in the top, he stopped. You will need to be careful. Not with other people. With yourself. Power at that level, after years of suppression, finding its full range, it will need time to settle. Pi said the same thing. Pi is competent, Snape said, which from him was extravagant praise. He moved toward the door. Paused with his hand on the frame. Don't let them turn this into something they can manage, he said, without turning around. The investigation. The Ministry's version of accountability. Don't let it become something quiet and procedural that ends with a fine and a letter of censure and everyone moving on. I won't, Harry said. Snape left. Harry sat for a moment in the room that smelled like old wood and fireplace ash and considered the very strange fact of having just had a conversation with Severus Snape that was functional. More than functional. He reached for the antagonism he'd been carrying toward Snape for 5 years and found it present but distant, secondary to more important architecture. He had bigger things to build around. The meeting Harry had said no to happened anyway on Friday afternoon. Not in the way Dumbledore had requested, not private, not convenient, not on the old man's terms. It happened in Amelia Bones's office at the Ministry of Magic, with Gemma Farley at Harry's right hand and Bones herself at her desk, and it happened because Farley had decided that getting Dumbledore's statement before he'd had time to consult further with his own legal representation was strategically valuable, and Bones had agreed, and Harry had said fine and meant it. Dumbledore arrived precisely on time, which somehow managed to carry its own kind of authority, the punctuality of someone who has never needed to be early and knows it. He was wearing deep blue robes, and his half-moon spectacles, and his expression was the one Harry knew best, open, warm, carrying the slight weight of great sorrow handled with great dignity. He looked at Harry across the room with something in his eyes that Harry had spent his life interpreting as love. That interpretation was now, not gone, exactly. More complicated. The way a word can look completely different once you've learned its etymology. Harry, he said. Dumbledore, Harry said. Not sir. Not professor. The first name, clean and deliberate, landing the way Harry intended it to land, as a redrawing of the terms. Dumbledore absorbed it without showing that he had. He sat in the chair across from Bones's desk, folded his hands in his lap, and looked precisely like a man who was in complete control of the situation he was in, which was either genuine equanimity or the most accomplished performance Harry had ever witnessed. I understand there are formal questions, Dumbledore said, directing this to Bones. There are, Bones said. This is a preliminary statement session. You've been advised of your right to have legal representation present. Your solicitor was notified this morning. I chose to come without one, Dumbledore said. I have nothing to hide and I don't intend to hide it. Bones's expression was professionally neutral. Farley's was the same. Harry's was, still. Then let's begin, Bones said. The questions were Bones's, framed with the precision of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how to build a picture from a sequence of specific answers. Dumbledore answered each one fully, without visible hesitation, and the answers were, Harry watched them with the attention of someone who had spent 2 days thinking about this moment, exactly what Arthur had described. The constructs were protective. The tracking charms were safety measures. The suppressors were safeguards against the Voldemort connection. Every answer was true in the way that partial truths are true. The loyalty-binding charm, Bones said. A pause. The first pause. Yes, Dumbledore said. Can you explain its purpose? I made a decision, Dumbledore said carefully, that Harry's survival through the coming years required absolute trust in his primary guide. That a young person, without stable family, without institutional loyalty, surrounded by active dark forces seeking to influence him, needed an anchor. An anchor you installed without his knowledge or consent, Bones said. He was 11, Dumbledore said. Children cannot meaningfully consent to complex magical protections. Complex magical protections, Farley said, and she said it with perfect neutrality, is a novel classification for a legally prohibited charm that biases a subject's emotional instincts toward a specific individual. Dumbledore looked at her. "You are Miss Farley." "I am," she said. "Can you tell us when you made the decision to apply the loyalty binding construct specifically? What your reasoning was at that exact moment?" "First year," Dumbledore said. "After the events surrounding the Philosopher's Stone. I observed in Harry a capacity for resistance and independent action that, in a child with his power level and his connection to Voldemort, represented a threat." Harry said. The room went quiet. This was the first time Harry had spoken. Dumbledore turned to look at him, and their eyes met, and Harry held it easily, without flinching, without the old instinctive softening that had always complicated his anger at this man, without the pull toward trust that had always been right there waiting to be activated. Gone. All of it, gone. "Not a threat," Dumbledore said. "A risk." "To what?" "To yourself," Dumbledore said, and the sorrow in his voice was real. Harry could see that, could feel it, and it changed nothing. "Harry, I have watched boys like you, powerful, alone, without guidance, without the tempering influence of earned trust and institutional loyalty, and I have watched what they become." "Boys like Tom Riddle," Harry said. Something moved in Dumbledore's face. "I am not Tom Riddle," Harry said. "I have never been Tom Riddle. And if there was any genuine evidence that I was at risk of becoming something dark, you had 15 years to show that evidence to someone. You didn't, because it doesn't exist. What exists is that you wanted control of something powerful, and you built a cage around it and called the cage protection." "That is not," Dumbledore started. "The suppression constructs were calibrated to my increasing magical output," Harry said. "As I got stronger, you strengthened them. You added to them. Construct 7 at age 2, 8 and 9 layered on at 11 and 13. Not a one-time protective measure. An ongoing project. You were maintaining it. Updating it. Watching your handiwork every time I set foot in your office." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment, and Harry looked back, and what Harry saw, really saw, clearly and without chemical assistance for the first time, was not a monster. Not a villain whose evil had been obscured. He saw an old man who had been making the decisions of a god for so long that he had genuinely lost the ability to understand why those decisions might not be his to make. That was, somehow, worse. "You could have told me," Harry said. His voice was even. "At any point. Any of it. The prophecy, the plan, the reasoning. Any of it. I was not an unreasonable child. I am not an unreasonable person. You could have told me and let me choose. You were too young, for years 1 through 4, perhaps. 5. 6. I'm 16 now. When was I going to be old enough?" Dumbledore was quiet. "That's what I thought," Harry said. "Harry." Dumbledore's voice was quiet and very careful. "Everything I did was to keep you alive. To keep Voldemort from winning. The cost was mine to pay," Harry said. "You decided the cost, and you took it from me without asking, and then you called it protection." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't think you're a bad man. I think you're a man who decided a long time ago that he knew best, and I think every year that decision was never seriously challenged it got easier to make. And I think somewhere in the last 15 years you stopped asking whether it was right and started just doing it. Because it worked. Because I was still alive and Voldemort was still losing and the logic was still intact." Dumbledore did not speak. "But I should have been the one deciding," Harry said. "My life. My magic. My risk. Mine." The room was completely quiet. Bones was watching Harry with the focused attention of someone witnessing something they'll be thinking about for a long time. Farley had stopped writing. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, 16 years old, without 35 threads running from him to an office in a tower, and for just a moment the architecture of his certainty showed something behind it, not doubt exactly, not remorse in any clean or simple sense, but a fracture. A place where the long game had run up against something it couldn't move or manage or plan around. A person who had decided to be one. I see, Dumbledore said. Good, Harry said. Bones cleared her throat, not unkindly. I think we should take a short recess before. No need, Harry said, settling back. We can continue. He looked at Bones. What's next on your question list? Bones looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her list. The timing of the suppression constructs relative to key events in Mr. Potter's life, she said, and her voice was back to its clipped, professional register, and the room organized itself around the work again. Dumbledore answered. He kept answering, methodically, completely, in the way of someone who has decided that the most dignified position available to him now is full transparency, who has done the calculation and concluded that the truth, managed carefully, is less damaging than the truth managed badly. Harry listened. He listened to the whole architecture of it, the decisions and the reasoning and the timeline, and he filed it carefully, and he felt the specific sensation of pieces of his own history becoming legible. Events that had felt random or inexplicable taking on the shape of managed outcomes. Moments of inexplicable passivity revealing the mechanism behind them. It was not comfortable. It was, however, clarifying in a way that he would not have traded. Near the end of the session, Dumbledore looked at him directly and said, I am sorry, Harry. And then, with a very slight pause, truly. Harry held his eyes for a moment. I know you mean that, he said. I know it's real. Then, it doesn't change what you did, Harry said. The apology is yours to make and I'll let you make it. The legal process is Amelia's, and I'll let her run it. Those are two separate things and they don't cancel each other out. Something in Dumbledore's expression went through a sequence of emotions too quickly to fully track. The world still needs, he started. I know what the world needs, Harry said. I've known since I was 11. I know there's a war coming and I know what part I'm expected to play in it. He paused. What's different now is that it's going to be my choice to play it. Not something I was built toward. Not something installed in me. Mine. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Yes, he said, finally, and it was barely above a whisper. I suppose it is. They came out of the ministry into the late afternoon, where the city had gone golden with the specific low light of early September, and the street was full of ordinary people going about ordinary Friday business. Harry stood on the pavement outside the telephone box entrance and breathed. Farley was already reviewing her notes, walking alongside him with the efficient forward momentum of someone whose brain doesn't fully disengage from a problem. He gave us more than I expected, she said. The admission about the loyalty charm as a response to observing your magical capacity and independence, that's significant. It establishes intent and it defeats any pure protection defense. I know, Harry said. You were good in there, she said, and said it the way she said most things, as information, not flattery. You kept it focused. You didn't let him redirect you. He's very good at redirecting people, Harry said. I noticed. They walked in comfortable silence for half a block. Snape's statement, Harry said. I'll see him tomorrow morning. If his information is what you indicated, his witness statement on the pattern of decision-making, the internal knowledge of Dumbledore's monitoring of you, will be very useful for establishing the systematic nature. She paused. It's a complicated source, politically. He knows that, Harry said. He came anyway. She glanced at him sideways. You've had an interesting week for alliances. That's one word for it. His wand hand tingled. That had been happening since the removal of the suppression constructs, a low-level awareness of his own magic that was new and slightly startling in its constancy. Not unpleasant. More like hearing a sound that had always been there but had been muffled, and discovering that unmuffled it was actually quite significant. He thought about Dumbledore's face at the end. The moment when the architecture of certainty had shown the fracture. He thought about whether that fracture was the beginning of something or just the exposure of something that had always been there. He thought about 35 charms. 35 individual decisions to place something on a child without asking. Not one moment of doubt, not one moment of perhaps I should tell him, perhaps he deserves to know, and then he thought, or perhaps there were those moments. Perhaps there had been doubts, every year, quiet and private. And Dumbledore had made the choice to override them, over and over, with the tremendous conviction of a man who trusted his own judgment above all else. That was not monstrous. It was perhaps more troubling than monstrous. It was the way the worst things happened, not through cruelty but through certainty. He pulled out his wand, not for any particular purpose, just to hold it. It was warm in his hand, humming faintly with the connection that had strengthened considerably since Monday. He turned it over once, put it away. He was going to be fine, Farley had said. He'd said he knew. He thought about it now, seriously, and found that he did know, not in the reassuring, compliance-adjacent way he would have known it 2 weeks ago, when fine was the automatic answer regardless of anything. But genuinely. With open eyes. He was going to be fine because he was going to make it that way. He turned the corner and walked back toward the leaky cauldron, where Ron would be waiting with something to eat and something to say about Quidditch as a form of mood management, and Hermione would be waiting with 30 pages of notes and the aggressive competence that was her version of love, and the Weasleys were probably already there filling the bar with noise and warmth and the particular chaos of a family that makes space for people. He walked toward it. Chose it, cleanly. The choice was his. Chapter 4, leveraged. The first time Harry understood the full scope of what had been taken from him, he was in a practice room. It was Saturday morning, 2 days after the ministry meeting, and Farley had suggested, with the careful phrasing of someone managing multiple moving parts, that Harry take the weekend away from legal proceedings. Not because there was nothing to do. Because there was too much, and the human brain, even a very good one, needed intervals. Ron had immediately said Quidditch with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to say it for days. Harry had said yes before the word was fully out of Ron's mouth. The practice room was a disused warehouse space behind Diagon Alley that George Weasley had quietly rented 3 months ago for reasons he described as experimental, and which involved a cushioning charm on every surface and an expansion charm on the ceiling that took it to roughly the height of a Quidditch pitch. Fred had been there when they arrived, sitting on an upturned crate eating an apple, and had looked at Harry with an expression that managed to say, "We heard everything and we're furious on your behalf and we're not going to make a whole thing of it," in the space of about half a second. "All right, Harry," Fred had said. "Getting there," Harry had said. "Good enough," Fred had said, and thrown him a quaffle. They'd played a loose, unstructured version of one-on-one keep-away for about 20 minutes, Harry and Ron versus Fred and George, which was not a fair matchup in terms of coordination, but Harry made up for it in sheer speed, or at least he usually did. Today he was faster than that. He noticed it on the third pass. He went for the quaffle and his broom responded to him differently, not mechanically. The broom was the same broom, but the connection was different. The intention-to-movement ratio had shifted. He thought left and was left before he'd registered the thought completing. He thought up and the acceleration was startling enough that he actually laughed, out loud, real and surprised. "Blimey," Ron said, from across the warehouse, having just watched Harry cover 30 feet in about a second and a half. "Yeah," Harry said. He hovered for a moment and felt the magic in him like a second circulatory system, present and mapped and fully functional. He'd been aware of it all week, the tingling in his wand hand, the heightened connection, the sense of being in his own body in a way that was new and immediate. But here, in physical motion, it was different. It was demonstrable. He thought about Healer Pye saying exceptional and stopping himself. He thought about Snape saying considerable with a very specific weight. He pointed his wand at the quaffle, which was floating somewhere near the far wall, and said, "Accio," and it came to him so fast that it cracked against his palm with a force that would have been concerning if he hadn't instinctively reinforced his grip without thinking about it. Fred was watching him with wide eyes. George had lowered his apple. "Right," George said. "How long has it been like that?" Fred asked. "Since Monday," Harry said. Since they removed the constructs. Healer said it would take time to settle. Settle, Fred repeated, as if tasting the word. Yeah, I don't think that's going to settle, mate. I think that's just, you. Harry turned his wand over in his hand. He cast a lumos without speaking, non-verbally, without particular concentration, and the light that burst from the tip was bright enough to illuminate the entire warehouse, every corner, bright as full daylight, and held steady without any effort at all. He looked at it. Ron had come down to hover beside him on his broom. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Does it feel weird? Ron asked. No, Harry said, and that was the truest thing about it. That's the thing. It feels normal. Like it's how it was always supposed to feel and I just never had access to it. He cancelled the lumos. The weird part is knowing it wasn't accessible before. Knowing every time I cast a spell for 5 years I was doing it through a filter. Like playing piano with 3 fingers taped together. And now. Harry looked at his wand. All 10 fingers, he said. Fred made a sound that was half a laugh and half something more serious, and then said, show us something, then, with the genuine scientific curiosity of someone who actually wants the data. Harry thought for a moment. Then he pointed his wand at the empty center of the warehouse floor and cast a full protego, not at anything, just into the space, let it build and hold, gave it real intent. The shield that materialized was about 12 feet across and 2 inches thick and cast a faint prismatic shimmer in the morning light, and it sat there in the air humming with stability, and Harry held it without strain, without concentration, essentially without effort, the way you hold your arm out without particularly thinking about the muscles involved. The 4 of them looked at it. 3 years ago, Fred said, to no one in particular, when Dumbledore wouldn't let him try out for the Quidditch team in first year, Fred, Ron said. No, I'm just thinking about it systemically, Fred said. Like, looking back at the whole picture, Fred. I'm angry, Fred said, simply and without drama. I'm allowed to be angry. Yeah, Harry said. He let the shield dissolve. You are. He looked at his wand hand, and thought about 5 years of spell work done through a suppression web, the accrued difference between what he'd done and what he'd have been capable of, and chose not to follow that particular thought to its end, because that way lay a kind of grief that he'd decided to save for later. Right now there was this, the warehouse, and the magic that was finally full-ranged, and his friends on their brooms around him, and the simple straightforward pleasure of knowing what he was. He kicked his broom upward and said, again, and they played until noon. The thing about leverage, Farley explained over tea on Monday morning, was that it only worked if the other side understood the full scope of what you held. She had laid out the case architecture on her desk, not notes this time but a proper map, connected by charmed red thread, the kind of thing Harry associated with aura investigations. At the center, boxed in red, the diagnostic scroll and its 35 entries. Radiating outward, Dumbledore's statement, Snape's witness statement, the chain of custody documentation, the St. Mungo's medical records, the legal citations Hermione had built into a comprehensive 28-page brief that Farley had read twice and described as thorough. She had also added, overnight, something new. Piggybacking, Harry said, reading the card she'd placed at the outer edge of the map. Your healer flagged it in his follow-up report. Farley tapped the card. The suppression web was Dumbledore's construction, anchored to his office. But a suppression web of that complexity, maintained over 14 years, it casts a significant magical signature. Like a lighthouse. Anyone with the right diagnostic tools and knowledge of what to look for could, theoretically, detect the web's existence and the fact that it was suppressing a core of unusual power. Harry looked at her steadily. And someone did. The Ministry's diagnostic team, when they ran their independent verification scan on Friday, found residual evidence of a secondary monitoring presence. She paused. Not constructs. Not charms. Something more passive. An observation anchor, they're calling it. Something designed not to interfere but to watch. Watch what? Watch the web. Watch the containment. She looked at him directly. Watch for when it failed. The room was quiet. Voldemort, Harry said. Unknown. The signature is dark magic, but the specific origin can't be determined from residual evidence. She leaned back. What we know is that someone, at some point in the last several years, became aware that your magical core was being suppressed and chose not to interfere, and to monitor instead. Waiting for it to break, Harry said. That's the logical inference. If the web was suppressing a significant magical core, its failure would represent a significant event. A power coming fully online that had been offline for years. Someone with the right orientation toward that event might want to be paying close attention when it happened. Harry thought about the Hogwarts Express. The timing. The suppression web failing over the summer, finally giving way under the sustained pressure of his own magic pushing back, the collapse coming on the 1st of September, the first day of term. He thought about a presence watching. Waiting. Does Bones know? He asked. I've already sent her the follow-up report. Farley began moving things on the map, rearranging the threads. It adds a dimension to the investigation that complicates the clean narrative somewhat. Because it suggests the suppression web, regardless of intent, may have functioned as a security asset, Harry said. That by suppressing my power, Dumbledore was inadvertently, or possibly deliberately, preventing this other party from being drawn to me. Farley looked at him. Yes. That's the argument his solicitor will make. His solicitor, Harry noted. He has one now. As of this morning. Oswald Pembridge, who is broadly considered the best criminal defense practitioner in the wizarding world and who has, in 30 years of practice, won 42 of 46 Wisengamot criminal trials. She said this without inflection, as pure information. Great, Ron said, from the chair in the corner where he'd been quiet long enough that Harry had nearly forgotten he was there. It means the prosecution will need to be airtight, Farley said. Pembridge will use everything. The greater good framing, the Voldemort connection, the security asset argument, the question of whether the loyalty-binding charm can be classified as a genuine protection in the specific context of an 11-year-old with an active connection to the Dark Lord. She paused. He will also, almost certainly, try to make the investigation itself about Voldemort's threat to Harry rather than Dumbledore's actions. Turn the story around, Harry said. Redirect attention from what was done to why it was supposedly necessary. She folded her hands. Which is why I want to add something to our case before the formal hearing date is set. What? Public record, she said. Not through the Prophet, we are not playing Skeeter's game and we don't need to. There is a formal Wisengamot procedure for entering case documentation into public record before a hearing. It's rarely used, but it's clean and it's legally sound, and it means the evidence cannot be quietly managed or reduced in the lead-up to the hearing. Everything we have goes on the permanent record. If it's on permanent record, Hermione said from the small couch where she'd been following the conversation with intense focus, then even if the criminal charges are reduced or the hearing finds in Dumbledore's favor, the evidence itself cannot be sealed, expunged, or revised, Farley confirmed. It becomes part of the ministry's public record. Available to historians, legal scholars, future investigators. Permanent. Harry thought about Snape's words, don't let them turn this into something they can manage. A fine and a letter of censure and everyone moving on. Do it, Harry said. Farley nodded, made a note. One more thing. She found a new document in her stack. This one with a red seal Harry recognized as Gringotts. Your inheritance solicitor contacted me this morning. My what? You're the sole heir to the Potter estate, which has been in trust at Gringotts since your parents' deaths. She set the document on the desk. The trust was designed to become fully accessible to you at 17, the wizarding age of majority. However, under circumstances where the designated guardian has been found to have engaged in illegal magical interference with the beneficiary's person, Gringotts inheritance law has a provision for early access review. Harry stared at the document. "You're not destitute, Mr. Potter," Farley said, with the slight dryness of someone who has seen the Gringotts figures. "You are, in fact, quite far from destitute. The trust contains assets that would qualify you as financially independent by any metric." She slid the document across the desk. "The Gringotts review can be initiated immediately. Given the circumstances, I expect it to be resolved quickly." Harry picked up the document. He looked at the Gringotts letterhead, the formal language, the figures that were visible in the summary line. He was aware that he should be surprised. He wasn't, particularly. The Potters had been a prominent family, he'd known that in a vague, untested way. He just hadn't expected this specific morning to be the moment when it became concrete and immediately relevant. "Independence," Hermione said, quietly. "Not a question. Legal, magical, and financial," Farley confirmed. Harry set the document down. "Start the Gringotts review," he said. "And get me a meeting with their head of Inheritance Trust. Already scheduled for Wednesday." "Of course it is," Ron said. The Prophet's Monday edition ran a follow-up piece. Not Skeeter this time. Someone had clearly decided that the story was too significant for her particular brand of sharp innuendo and needed the gravitas of their senior political correspondent. The headline was more measured: "Dumbledore retains Pembridge as Wisengamot hearing looms, greater good defense expected." Harry read it over breakfast at the Leaky Cauldron and set it aside without visible reaction. The article was well-informed, which meant Pembridge had been talking strategically to the press. It framed Dumbledore's actions as tragic but explicable, a great man making difficult decisions in the context of extraordinary danger. It quoted 3 anonymous Wisengamot members expressing concern about the investigation's effect on institutional stability during a period of renewed threat. "They're already building the narrative," Hermione said. "So are we," Harry said. The Morning Post brought a second letter he hadn't expected, in an envelope with a Hogwarts seal but not the Headmaster's sigil. He opened it and found a single folded page in handwriting he recognized after a moment as Professor McGonagall's. "Mr. Potter, I am writing not in my official capacity but as an individual who has been made aware of the events of the past week in full. I want you to know that several members of the Hogwarts faculty, myself among them, consider what has been done to you to be a serious wrong and are prepared to say so, formally, if called upon. I also want to say, personally, that I am sorry. Not for anything I did, I had no knowledge of the constructs, but because I should have looked more carefully. I have been watching over you since you were born and I failed to see what was happening directly in front of me. That is something I will carry. If there is anything within my power that would be useful to you, you have only to ask. Minerva McGonagall." Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close, which was not a conscious decision but a real one. "McGonagall?" Ron asked, reading his face. "Yeah. What does she say?" "That she's with us," Harry said. "And that she's sorry." Ron nodded. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." The development Harry had been expecting and hadn't known exactly when to expect arrived on Tuesday afternoon, in the form of a very specific kind of magical disruption at the Leaky Cauldron. He felt it before he heard anything, a ripple in the ambient magic of the building, like a stone dropped in still water, spreading from the entrance. He was in the middle of reviewing the public record documentation with Farley and Hermione, and he stopped talking mid-sentence and stood up. "Harry?" Hermione said. He'd already crossed to the door and opened it before he could articulate what he was moving toward. The main bar of the Leaky Cauldron had gone quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something has walked in that demands attention. Tom the barkeep was standing very still behind the counter. 3 other patrons were in various stages of having frozen in place. The man standing in the entrance was not particularly remarkable in appearance. Medium height, nondescript robes, a face that managed to be simultaneously ordinary and somehow slightly off, like a mask that fit very well but was still a mask. He was standing in the doorway with his hands visible and his posture carefully non-threatening, which itself communicated that he was someone who knew what threatening looked like and was deliberately performing its absence. He looked at Harry. His eyes were pale, and they held the clinical interest of someone assessing a variable that had unexpectedly changed value. "Mr. Potter," he said. His voice was cultured, precisely modulated. "My employer sends his regards. Tell your employer," Harry said, from the doorway of the back room, "that I'm busy." A slight smile. He anticipated that response. "He asked me to convey that he is aware of the observation anchor the ministry found. He wants you to know that was not his." Harry looked at the man steadily. "Then whose?" "That's the question, isn't it?" The man reached into his robes slowly, with the exaggerated care of someone making sure nobody misread the gesture, and produced an envelope. Plain, white, unaddressed. He set it on the nearest table. He thought you might find the contents useful, given your current proceedings. "What's in it?" "Information about who placed the secondary anchor and when." The man adjusted his cuffs with precise, unhurried movements. "My employer has a vested interest in your proceedings being accurate. He doesn't want credit for something he didn't do." A pause. "He's also, if I may, curious about you. The version of you that exists without 35 threads pulling at your instincts." "Curious," Harry said. "He describes it as an intellectual interest," the man said, with the air of quoting exactly. "The board has changed. He's reassessing." "Tell him the board changed because I changed it," Harry said. "Tell him the reassessment can stay theoretical for now." "He thought you'd say that too." The smile again, slight and precise. "He said to tell you, good." He looked at the envelope on the table. "You should read that before the formal hearing. It concerns someone currently operating inside the ministry who has been using the monitoring network for purposes unrelated to your welfare." And then he was gone, not dramatically, not with a crack of apparition or a flourish. He simply moved to the door and left, and a moment later the ambient magic of the room settled back to its baseline. Harry stood where he was for a moment. Tom the barkeep let out a long, slow breath. The other patrons gradually reanimated. Harry walked to the table and picked up the envelope. He turned it over. Clean on both sides. He broke the seal, which was plain wax with no sigil, and opened it. Inside was a single piece of parchment with a list of dates, times, and magical signatures, structured exactly like an observation log, the kind Aurors kept. He scanned it quickly, and then he went back to the third entry and read it again more slowly, and felt something shift in his understanding of the past week. The secondary observation anchor, the one the ministry diagnostic team had flagged as a passive monitoring presence attached to Dumbledore's suppression web, had been placed 14 months ago. Not by Voldemort. The magical signature on record was cross-referenced against ministry staff records. The name on the cross-reference was one Harry recognized. He took the parchment, went back into the corridor, and said, "Hermione. Get Farley. Get Bones if you can reach her tonight." Hermione read his face. "What happened?" He handed her the parchment. She read it, and went very still, and then looked up at him with wide eyes. "Is this real?" "I don't know yet," Harry said. "But if it is, it means someone in the ministry has been running their own monitoring operation using Dumbledore's network as a carrier signal," she said. "Someone who knew about the suppression web, knew what it was containing, and decided to attach their own intelligence operation to it. And who started monitoring," Harry said, 14 months ago. "Right around the time Voldemort came back." Hermione looked at the name on the parchment. "He's on the Wisengamot," she said. "Yeah. He's on the committee overseeing Bones's investigation." "Yeah," Harry said. "Which is probably why he's still there." She looked at him for a moment. "We can't take this to Bones directly, it came from, I know where it came from," Harry said. "But the information is either accurate or it isn't, and if it's accurate it's going to show up in the ministry's own diagnostic records when someone looks specifically for it." We don't need to disclose the source. We just need to point Bones in the right direction. That's a fine legal line, Hermione said. I know. He paused. What's on the other side of it? A cleaner case, she admitted. If there's a third party who's been exploiting the suppression web for their own monitoring purposes, it demonstrates that Dumbledore's construction created dangers beyond his control, and it potentially explains why the web didn't get flagged through Ministry channels in 14 years. Someone was making sure it didn't, Harry said. Hermione looked at the parchment again. Cornelius Fudge, she said. He's been Minister for Magic for 10 years. And for the last 14 months, Harry said, he's had a private window into Dumbledore's surveillance of me. Knowing exactly where I was, what my magical state was, how the suppression was holding. He thought about last year. About the Ministry's campaign against him and Dumbledore both. About the Daily Prophet pieces calling him a liar, calling Dumbledore a destabilizing force. He was playing Dumbledore and me off against each other while holding information on both of us. Hermione set the parchment down on the table with great care, the way you set down something fragile. This changes the hearing, she said. This changes a lot of things, Harry said. He didn't feel satisfaction, exactly. He felt the clean engagement of someone working a complicated problem who has just received a significant piece of information and can see, suddenly, where it fits. The problem was larger than it had appeared. That was not alarming. Larger problems had more surfaces to work with. Call Farley, he said again. And find out if Bones is still at the Ministry. Farley arrived in 20 minutes. Bones was still at the Ministry and agreed to a secure fluke call from Farley's chambers, which was where the three of them went, leaving Ron at the Leaky Cauldron with instructions to contact the Weasleys and get Arthur to start looking into Fudge's movements 14 months ago through whatever channels he had. The fluke call lasted 45 minutes. Bones asked 3 clarifying questions about the parchment, asked Harry twice about the source and accepted twice that the source couldn't be disclosed, and then went quiet for approximately 30 seconds. The Ministry diagnostic team ran their scan under standard parameters, she said finally. They were looking for constructs attached to Mr. Potter's core signature. The secondary anchor was flagged because it was attached to the suppression web, which was attached to his core. If they ran a targeted scan on the web itself, specifically looking for secondary monitoring signatures across its full 14-year history, you'd find Fudge's anchor, Harry said. Independent of anything I've given you. It would take approximately 6 hours of diagnostic work, Bones said. And it would require a court order to access the full scan records. Which you can get, Farley said. A pause. Yes, Bones said. I can get that. He's on your oversight committee, Farley said carefully. I'm aware, Bones said. He's also the Minister for Magic, which makes this complicated, Harry offered. I was going to say significant, Bones said. But yes. Complicated as well. Another pause. Mr. Potter. Yes. Are you aware of what you've just handed me? A large and complicated problem, Harry said. The single biggest political investigation this ministry has seen in 30 years, she said. The Headmaster of Hogwarts on criminal charges for illegal magical interference. The Minister for Magic potentially implicated in unauthorized intelligence operations using that same interference as cover. And at the center of it, a 16-year-old on whose core both of them built their operations, Harry said. Yes. I'm aware of the optics. How are you? Bones asked, and again it was the real question, not the procedural one. Harry thought about the practice room and the Protego shield humming in the air with zero effort. He thought about McGonagall's letter in his jacket pocket. He thought about Snape saying considerable and Fred saying that's just you, Mate and Farley saying you're going to be fine and Ron on his broom in the warehouse saying blimey and meaning something much larger than the word. I'm good, Harry said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant it in a very long time. Let's finish this. He walked back to the Leaky Cauldron alone through the evening streets of Diagon Alley, which was winding down for the night, shopkeepers turning signs and lights going warm in windows, the ordinary business of the ordinary wizarding world that was. He could see it now, feel it now, without the emotional dampening that had made it all slightly remote, genuinely beautiful. The chaos of it, the particularity, the specific smell of it in September. He had 35 constructs removed from his core. He had Farley, and Bones, and Snape's statement, and McGonagall's letter, and a piece of information that had probably been sent to him by the most dangerous wizard alive for reasons that were entirely self-interested and still happened to be useful. He had Ron and Hermione, which was not a new thing but was a newly felt one, the full weight of it, unfiltered, hitting where it was supposed to hit. He had his own magic, finally, genuinely, entirely his. He had a case that was going to crack open the Ministry's 40-year-old structure of managed power and complicit silence, and he was going to be the one who put it in front of the Wisengamot on permanent record, and whatever came after it was going to come at a version of him that nobody had built toward a specific outcome. The night air was cool and smelled like coming rain. He was 16 years old and he was free. Chapter 5. The board resets Wednesday arrived the way significant days often do, quietly, with no particular fanfare, wearing the ordinary clothes of an ordinary morning until you were already inside it and it was too late to brace for it properly. Harry was up at 6. Not because he had to be, not because anxiety had driven him out of sleep, but because he woke up and his brain was already running and lying down felt like wasted time. He dressed in the grey light, listened to Ron's steady breathing across the room, and went down to the Leaky Cauldrons bar, which was empty at that hour except for Tom moving around behind the counter with the slow, meditative efficiency of someone who has been opening up the same establishment for 30 years. Tom set a cup of tea in front of him without being asked and went back to whatever he was doing, which was exactly the right response. Harry sat with the tea and thought about Gringotts. The meeting was at 9. Farley had briefed him the night before. Ragnarok, the senior trust manager, would present the full estate inventory, the trust terms, and the early access review findings. Harry had asked what the review was likely to find and Farley had said favorable, given the circumstances with a precision that suggested she already knew the answer and was letting him discover it in the right setting. He thought about financial independence and what it actually meant in practice, not the abstract concept, which he'd been aware of all week, but the specific daily reality. No Dursleys. No requirement to return to Privet Drive at any point for any reason. No dependence on anyone's goodwill or generosity, which had always been the invisible ceiling on his autonomy even when surrounded by people who were genuinely generous and genuinely good-willed. The thought sat with him warmly, without guilt. That was new too. Hermione came down at 6:30 with her hair still processing whatever it did overnight and a look on her face that meant she'd been awake for a while thinking. She dropped into the chair across from him, accepted the tea Tom immediately produced, and said, "I've been thinking about the fudge angle." "Morning to you too," Harry said. "If Bones gets the diagnostic court order today, which Farley says she can, magistrate's emergency procedure for active investigations, and if the scan confirms Fudge's anchor on the suppression web, then she has to decide whether to run 2 separate investigations or consolidate." "Consolidate is cleaner," Harry said. "One hearing, full picture." "But consolidation means Fudge's solicitor can argue the 2 cases muddy each other. That prosecuting them together creates reasonable doubt on both. Dumbledore's defense becomes Fudge's interference compromised the integrity of my network and Fudge's defense becomes I was monitoring a known security risk, not engaging in illegal surveillance." "They'd be pointing at each other," Harry said. "Pointing at each other while both pointing at you," Hermione said. "Making you the reason both of them did what they did. The threat that justified everything." Harry drank his tea and thought about that. Bones won't let that happen. Bones can't control what their solicitors argue. No, but she controls what she investigates and how she frames it. He set down his cup. "The Dumbledore case is built on illegal magical interference with a person. That's personal, that's about me, that's about what was done to my body and my autonomy. The Fudge case is an intelligence operation using ministry resources for unauthorized surveillance. They're different categories." "So separate hearings," Hermione said. "Same evidence base, different legal frameworks. Farley will have the same thought, Harry said. Farley already did, Hermione said. She owed me at midnight. I may have replied immediately. Harry looked at her. I wasn't asleep, she said, slightly defensively. He almost smiled. Obviously. Ron came down 20 minutes later and ate half a loaf of toast with the focused appetite of someone who has decided breakfast is today's primary project, and they sat together in the quiet morning bar while Diagon Alley slowly woke up outside, and it felt uncomplicated. Which was its own kind of good, given what the rest of the day was going to be. Gringotts was exactly as Harry remembered it, vast, cold, the vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, the goblins at their counters doing things that were clearly important and not interested in being observed. The difference today was that he was expected. A goblin in slightly more formal attire than the counter staff met them at the main entrance and escorted Harry and Farley through a side door Harry had never noticed, down a corridor that was clearly not the tourist route, and up 2 floors by a staircase carved directly into the stone. Ragnar's office was larger than Harry expected for a creature who stood roughly chest-height to him, and every surface was covered in organized documentation that gave off the faint magical signature of extremely well-maintained records. Ragnar himself was old. Harry didn't have the vocabulary to estimate goblin age, but the weight of long practice sat in every one of his movements, and he looked at Harry with the direct, unsentimental appraisal that goblins gave everything. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Sit." They sat. "I will be direct," Ragnar said, which Harry appreciated immediately. The Potter Trust has been in continuous management by this institution since November 1981. It was established by James and Lily Potter with instructions that their estate pass in full to their son Harry James Potter at the age of wizarding majority, with a Gringotts Trust manager appointed as interim steward. He produced a leather-bound ledger and opened it to a bookmarked page. The early access review, he said, was triggered by circumstances qualifying under Clause 9 of the original trust deed, interference with the beneficiary's person by a party in a position of authority over the trust. The clause exists because James Potter was, evidently, a man who thought carefully about contingencies. Harry looked at the ledger page. He read the figures, and they were, he was aware of the Potters being a prominent family, he'd been told the vault contained money, and he'd used it for school supplies without thinking too carefully about the totals. He had not quite extrapolated to this. This includes the family vault, Ragnar continued, the property holdings, 3 properties, 2 currently under maintenance preservation spells, the family library contents, the investment instruments currently returning approximately, he named a figure. Per year, Harry said. Per month, Ragnar said. Harry kept his expression level. There is also the matter of a secondary bequest, Ragnar continued. Filed 14 months after the original trust, by the trust co-manager at the time. Who was the co-manager? Sirius Black, Ragnar said. He filed a secondary document prior to his imprisonment, which has been held in sealed trust pending either his release, his death, or your access to the primary trust. Given recent events, Ragnar paused, and there was something in the pause that was not quite sympathy but was its closest goblin equivalent, the secondary document transfers to you automatically. He produced a second envelope, this one sealed with wax that bore both the Gringotts seal and something Harry recognized after a moment as the Black family crest. He held the envelope and didn't open it yet. Additionally, Ragnar said, Mr. Black updated his primary estate designation in the months before his death. The Black family estate, which is considerable, designates you as sole beneficiary. He watched Harry's face with the focused attention of someone who manages the financial consequences of difficult emotional moments regularly. You will be aware that this includes the family home at 12 Grimmauld Place. Yes, Harry said quietly. If you wish, I can give you a moment. No, Harry said. Let's finish. Ragnar covered the remaining items efficiently and without excessive detail, the 3 properties, 1 in Wales, 1 in Edinburgh, 1 in the south of France that Harry had absolutely no memory of anyone mentioning, the library inventory, the investment structure. Farley took notes and asked 3 technical questions that Ragnock answered with the curt respect of someone who recognizes competence. At the end, Harry held 2 envelopes and a ledger summary and the specific dazed quality of someone who has just had the coordinates of their life shifted significantly and needs a moment to recalibrate. Full access, Ragnock said, is granted as of this meeting. The trust seal is dissolved. Gringotts will continue to manage the investment instruments unless you instruct otherwise. Continue for now, Harry said. I'll be in contact about the properties. Ragnock nodded. There is one final matter. Harry waited. The clause that triggered the early access review, Ragnock said, includes a provision. Any interference with the beneficiary's person by a party in a position of authority over the trust, under the original deed, Albus Dumbledore was listed as a secondary trustee. Harry went very still. A secondary trustee, Farley said, very precisely, who placed illegal magical constructs on the primary beneficiary. Yes, Ragnock said. Which means, under Goblin Trust law, which operates in parallel to Ministry magical law and is specifically recognized in the 1782 Banking Accord, he is in breach of fiduciary duty to the trust. Gringotts will be filing a parallel civil claim. Farley's quill had stopped moving. She looked at Ragnock with the expression of someone who has just found an additional card in a hand they thought was already strong. The 1782 Banking Accord supersedes standard Wisengamot jurisdiction in matters of estate trust breach, she said. Correct, Ragnock said. We will be handling our proceedings independently. We simply thought you should know. Harry looked at him. Thank you, he said. Ragnock tilted his head slightly. James Potter was a good client, he said, which from a Gringotts trust manager was apparently a statement of considerable weight. They came out of Gringotts into the morning bustle of Diagon Alley and Harry stopped on the steps and opened the letter from Sirius. Farley stepped slightly back to give him distance, which he appreciated. The letter was not long. Harry, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. That's how it went, I suppose. Don't spend too long on the sad part. I wasn't very good at staying out of trouble even when I tried, and I suspect you already know that. What I want you to know is this, you are not the boy they made you. Whatever they built around you, whatever they decided about you before you were old enough to decide for yourself, that's not you. The you I know is the one who chose to come for me in the ministry without hesitating, and the one who learned to fly the first time he got on a broom like it was something he'd been doing for years, and the one who sometimes looks at me like he's trying to figure out how to say something important and can't quite find the words. I found the words, even if you couldn't. You're everything, Harry. That's what I wanted to say. The money is yours. Use it. Build something with it. Be free. Padfoot Harry stood on the steps of Gringotts in September sunshine and read the letter and let it hit where it hit, unfiltered and full, the way things were hitting now. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in the same inside pocket as McGonagall's letter. He stood up straight, blinked once, and said, Farley. The 3 properties. She looked at him carefully. Yes. The one in Edinburgh. How big is it? She checked her notes. The trust inventory describes it as a substantial townhouse. 5 bedrooms, private garden, recently under maintenance preservation so in good condition. Can it be made residential quickly? Like this week? With the right, I'm not staying at the Leaky Cauldron indefinitely, Harry said. I need a base. Somewhere that's mine, that's not connected to Dumbledore's network, not connected to Privet Drive, not connected to the Order. He paused. Somewhere I can have people. Farley looked at him for a moment. I can have a survey and readiness assessment done by Friday, she said. Edinburgh is within apparition range of Hogsmeade, which means if school resumes, I can be at Hogwarts and live there, Harry said. Those are 2 separate questions. Whether I go back to Hogwarts. That's a decision for another day. Yes, he agreed. But the house is for this week. Farley made a note. I'll contact the property manager. Harry came down the steps and back into the street, and the city moved around him in its ordinary Saturday way, and he was present in it, for the first time in a very long time, without the glass between himself and the texture of things. He pulled out his wand, without particular purpose, and cast a small incendio into the air above the alley, just a spark, just to feel it, and the spark that jumped from his wand was brighter and sharper than any spark he'd consciously produced in 5 years, and a passing witch with a shopping bag looked up at it startled, and Harry pocketed the wand and kept walking. The Hogwarts question found him first. Professor Flitwick's owl arrived at the Leaky Cauldron that afternoon, a neat, precise note in keeping with his neat, precise person, informing Harry that the Hogwarts Board of Governors had convened an emergency session that morning to discuss the school's status given the ongoing investigation and Dumbledore's legal situation. Dumbledore had submitted his own request for a leave of absence pending the hearing outcome. The board was in the process of appointing an interim headmaster. The note did not say who. It said only that Flitwick thought Harry should know the school's status before making any decisions, and that several of your teachers are hoping you'll return. Hermione read it over his shoulder. He recused himself, she said. Dumbledore. Before the board could push him out. Controlled exit, Ron said. Makes it look like a choice. It is a choice, Harry said. Just not a free one. Who do they appoint as interim? Hermione asked. McGonagall, presumably. Presumably, Harry said. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about Hogwarts, the specifics of it, the castle, the moving staircases and the great hall and the Quidditch pitch, the specific quality of the light in the library in the late afternoon, the way it smelled after rain. He'd called it home, reflexively, for 5 years. He'd defended it, bled for it, run toward it when everything else was falling apart. And now, for the first time, the question of whether to go back was genuinely a question. I want to go back, he said. Obviously, Ron said. But not as the same thing I was, Harry said. Not as, whatever the role was. The managed thing. The symbol. He paused, trying to articulate something he was working out in real time. If I go back, it's because I want to be there. Because I have work to do that requires it. Not because someone decided it was part of the plan. That's the same reason as before, Hermione said carefully. You always wanted to go back. I know. But the before version of that wanting had 35 things in it that weren't mine. So I'm checking the wanting again now that it's clean. He looked at them both. And it's still there. I still want to go back. Ron looked briefly relieved in the way of someone who had been prepared to support whatever decision was made but had a strong preference. Right, Hermione said. Then we go back. After the house is ready, Harry said. I'm not living in Gryffindor Tower while a Wisengamot hearing is active and Fudge is running loose. I need my own space. The Edinburgh house, Hermione said. I asked Farley about it. He paused. There's enough room. She looked at him. For more than just me, he clarified. Hermione pressed her lips together briefly, and her eyes did something complicated that had nothing to do with being upset and everything to do with the opposite. I'll tell my parents, she said. And I'll tell Mum, Ron said, already half standing, who is going to absolutely, she's going to cry, mate, I'm just warning you. I know, Harry said. Like, properly cry. Ron. Just managing expectations. Amelia Bones's court order came through on Thursday morning, 48 hours after she'd requested it. Harry knew before Farley called him because Hermione had a contact in the Ministry Records office, a detail she mentioned with the slight defensiveness of someone who knows it sounds improbable but isn't apologizing for it, who sent a brief coded note. The ministry's targeted scan of the suppression web's full 14-year history was run by Bones's own diagnostic team, independent of the standard ministry team. It took 4 hours. When it was done, Bones had her confirmation, a secondary monitoring anchor, placed 14 months ago, bearing a magical signature that matched on record to Cornelius Fudge's ministry-registered wand. The news broke publicly by Thursday afternoon. Not through the Prophet, Bones had moved faster than any leak, holding her own press briefing in the DMLE conference room with the crisp efficiency of someone who has decided that controlling the narrative is part of the job. She was direct, factual, and gave absolutely nothing away beyond what she'd verified. Harry watched it on the ministry's wireless feed from the Edinburgh house, which had been assessed, cleaned, and made broadly habitable in 48 hours by a team of specialists Farley had organized with the focused determination of someone who considers logistical problems personally offensive. The house was tall and stone-fronted and smelled like old books and wood polish, and every window looked out over a different section of Edinburgh that was both deeply ordinary and somehow specifically right. Ron and Hermione were on the sofa. Arthur and Molly were at the kitchen table with tea. Fred and George had shown up that morning on the grounds that the house needed inspecting, which had involved them walking through each room saying things like, good ceiling height and excellent exploding snap potential. McGonagall had flood at noon, formally, to say that the board had confirmed her as interim headmaster and she was requesting Harry's formal enrollment status for the coming term. Harry had said yes. He was sitting in the large front room now with the wireless playing Bones's briefing, watching the expressions on the Weasleys' faces as the confirmation of Fudge's surveillance operation was laid out in plain, clipped official language. Arthur put his teacup down very slowly when Bones named the minister explicitly. Molly said, "Oh, Cornelius," in a tone that was more exhausted than surprised, which said something specific about the landscape of ministry politics that Harry filed away. "He's going to resign," Fred said. "Today or tomorrow. No way he survives this." "Someone will try to defend him," George said. "Someone will try and fail," Fred said, with the breezy confidence of someone who has spent years watching things blow up and developed a reliable instinct for trajectories. Ron looked at Harry. "How are you feeling about all of this?" It was the right question and Ron was the right person to ask it, because the way Ron asked it had no agenda, no particular answer he was hoping for, no frame he was imposing. Just genuine interest in the actual answer. Harry thought about it seriously. "Like it's moving the way it's supposed to move," he said. "Like it's real and it's in motion and I'm part of it but not," he paused. "I'm not being moved. Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Ron said. "Yeah, that makes sense." "The board's reset," Harry said. He was half talking to himself, working out the shape of something. "Not just for me. For everything. Dumbledore's on leave, Fudge is finished, the suppression web is documented and on permanent record. The ministry has to look at itself." He paused. "Voldemort's still out there, which doesn't go away and isn't solved by any of this. But the way I go at that problem is different now." "Different how?" Hermione asked. "Before, it was, I was going to be walked toward it," Harry said. "Prepared. Managed. Pointed at it when the time was right. Like a weapon being aimed. And now? Now I'm going to make my own decisions about it." He looked at his wand hand. "With my own magic. With my own people." He looked at them both, Ron and Hermione on the sofa, the Weasleys in the next room, the house around him that was his and no one else's. "On my own terms." Hermione looked at him for a long time. "That's terrifying, you know," she said. "In the best possible way." "I know," Harry said. Friday morning brought two things Harry hadn't anticipated in quick succession. The first was that Cornelius Fudge resigned at 7 a.m. via a written statement to the Daily Prophet that spent 3 paragraphs on his years of service and 2 sentences on the surveillance matter, which he described as a precautionary monitoring measure, taken in the interests of public safety, and for which he expressed regret at any perception of impropriety. It was, Harry thought, one of the most thoroughly unsatisfying apologies he'd ever read. The second thing arrived at 8 a.m. in the form of Neville Longbottom on the front doorstep. Harry opened the door and found Neville standing there in Muggle clothes, slightly breathless, with his grandmother standing 3 steps behind him with her vulture hat and her unreadable expression. "I heard about the house," Neville said. "From Ginny, who heard from Fred. I hope this is all right. Of course it is, Harry said. Come in. Neville came in and Augusta Longbottom followed him with the bearing of a woman who considers every room she enters to have been waiting for her arrival. She looked around the front hallway, looked at Harry, and said, I owe you an apology, Mr. Potter. Harry blinked. You don't, I do, she said, in a tone that foreclosed debate. My grandson attempted to tell me on multiple occasions over the past 5 years that something was wrong with your situation. I dismissed his instincts in favor of my confidence in Albus Dumbledore's judgment. She looked at him with the direct, unflinching assessment of someone who has already held their own court and returned a verdict. That was a failure of discernment on my part, and I regret it. The monitoring was hidden, Harry said. Nobody could have seen it without the diagnostic scan. The monitoring, no, she said. But the pattern of decisions made about you, a child with no functional family, no independent advocate, no one outside Dumbledore's sphere of influence, that pattern was visible if one chose to look at it. She paused. I chose not to look at it closely enough. Harry looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without difficulty. Thank you, he said. She gave a small, precise nod, said, the Longbottom family will formally support the Wisengamot proceedings. I have some influence with the Old Guard members and I intend to use it appropriately, and then moved past him into the sitting room where she greeted Molly Weasley with the particular warmth of two women who have been making difficult decisions on behalf of children they love for a very long time. Neville stood in the hallway looking slightly apologetic. She had the speech ready, he said. It was a good speech, Harry said. I've been practicing for years to stand up to her, Neville said. I'm starting to think it's less about being brave enough and more about just having something to stand up for. Harry thought about that. Yeah, he said. That's probably right. They went through to the kitchen and Harry made tea, actually made it, kettle and cups and the slightly imprecise process of someone who has not historically been responsible for his own domestic arrangements and is finding it more satisfying than expected, and the house continued to fill up around him in the way it had been doing since Wednesday, incrementally, each arrival adding to the specific weight of people choosing to be present. Luna arrived at noon by flew with her father and a large potted plant that she said improved the magical ambience of new homes and that had small purple flowers Harry couldn't identify. Seamus and Dean appeared in the afternoon, having apparently received a message from Ron that Harry suspected was less formally worded than a proper invitation but functionally effective. Ginny arrived last, at 4:30, having come directly from an errand in Diagon Alley, and she walked in, looked around at the full front room, looked at Harry, and said, nice house, with the concise satisfaction of someone who means it as a complete sentence. Thanks, Harry said. The ward works good, she said. Whose? Mostly mine, actually, Harry said, and still felt slightly startled by that, by the ease of it, the ward construction he'd done the previous evening that had taken about 40 minutes and had come out far more layered and complex than he'd intended, the magic simply knowing what it was doing. Some of Farley's specialist. Ginny raised an eyebrow. You built your own wards. On my own house, he said. Seemed appropriate. She looked at him steadily for a moment, with the particular attention she gave things she was genuinely assessing, and then she said, you seem different. I am different, he said. Better different or just different? Better, he said, without hesitation. Much better. She nodded once. Then she looked past him at the full room, the Weasleys and Longbottoms and Lovegoods and the others, the noise and warmth of people who had all, in their different ways, decided to be here, and she said, good, and it landed the same way Ron's one-word responses landed, load-bearing and real. The formal Wisengamot hearing date was set on Friday afternoon, the notice arrived by Ministry Owl at 5:30, a crisp official document bearing Bones's seal. 3 weeks out. Both cases, Dumbledore's and Fudge's, had been confirmed as separate hearings, following Farley's recommendation, with Dumbledore's proceeding first. Harry read the date and felt, not apprehension, not dread, not the flinching instinct toward avoidance he'd have felt 2 weeks ago under 35 interlocking constructs telling him to defer and comply and trust. He felt ready. Cleanly, straightforwardly ready. He was pinning the notice to the kitchen wall, an impulse toward visibility, toward keeping the thing present and real, when McGonagall's fluff flared and she came through with the controlled precision of someone who does not stumble on floor arrivals, and stood in his kitchen in her Hogwarts robes and looked at the assembled chaos of his front room with an expression that was hard to read. "You've built something," she said. "Working on it," Harry said. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him when she forgot to be his teacher and was simply being herself, with pride that she usually managed to keep at a professional arm's length and occasionally didn't. "The board has confirmed term start for September 10th, she said. 2 weeks from Monday. We've been in communication with the DMLE about accommodating your hearing schedule. You'll be excused from classes on the 2 days of the hearing without penalty." "Hermione won't be happy about missing classes," Ron said from the doorway. "She's already asked me about getting the notes in advance," McGonagall said, without inflecting the sentence at all. "Of course she has," Ron said. "The castle is ready," McGonagall said, to Harry specifically. "Whatever it is you're returning to, it's yours the same as it always was." She paused. "And rather more so, now that I'm headmaster." Harry looked at her. "Different than Dumbledore's version of ready?" "I intend," she said, with crisp precision, "to run the school in a manner that treats the students as people rather than pieces." She paused again, and the slight tightness around her eyes said something about how long she'd held that particular frustration. "Starting now." "Good," Harry said. She stayed for tea, which surprised him slightly, and she sat at the kitchen table with Molly and Augusta Longbottom and Xenophilius Lovegood and participated in a conversation that ranged widely across school politics, the Wizengamot membership's likely alignment in the upcoming hearings, and a brisk debate on the merits of various defensive spell approaches to teaching. Flitwick's name came up several times in ways that suggested McGonagall's version of the school's faculty was going to have a somewhat different character than its previous iteration. Harry circulated through his own house, that was still a strange thought, his house, with the weight of real possession, and talked and listened and felt the specific texture of an evening that was being made, not managed. Not orchestrated toward anything. Just people who had chosen to be present in the same space. At some point in the evening, without planning it, he ended up in the back garden alone. Not because he needed solitude exactly, but because the evening was clear and the city sounds were distant and specific, and he wanted a moment with just the sky. He thought about Sirius's letter. "The you I know is the one who chose to come for me." He thought about Dumbledore's face in Bones's office when the architecture of his certainty had fractured. He thought about 35 constructs, all run to a single point. The web of it, the precision of it, the years of careful maintenance, and how none of it had ultimately been able to hold against the simple sustained pressure of his own magic pushing back. Not dramatically. Not in a single heroic moment. Just, steadily. Insistently. Day after day for 14 years, his magic pressing against the walls of the cage until the walls gave way. He hadn't been broken. Not fully, not permanently. He'd been compressed. And now the compression was gone and he was, this. Standing in a garden in Edinburgh on a clear September night, with people in the house behind him who had come of their own choosing, with magic in him that was finally free to be what it was, with the hearing date on his kitchen wall and 3 weeks to stand in the Wizengamot and put the whole truth into permanent public record. His wand sat warm in his hand. He hadn't consciously drawn it. He looked at it for a moment, then raised it toward the clear sky, not toward any target, not for any functional purpose. He cast a full lumos, everything he had behind it, which he was still learning the dimensions of, still discovering new rooms in, and the light that erupted from the tip was not a spark and not a beam. It was a burst, warm and clear and broad, flooding outward in a wide ring that lit the garden and the walls and the sky above like a second moon. He held it for 30 seconds. Then he let it fade, and stood in the dark again, and the dark felt fine. He knew his way in it. Inside the house, voices and light. Ron's laugh, bright and genuine. Hermione explaining something at speed. Luna's drifting observation. The Weasleys' collective, specific music. He stood in his own garden, in his own city, in his own life. Then he went back inside.